Chapter 55. 3 years into his tenure among the nation's most senior heroes, Izuku Midoriya received an invitation that carried, for him, a weight considerably more personal than the steady stream of commendations and formal recognitions that had come to define so much of his public professional life. UA High School's administration, in the process of expanding its outreach programs for students without documented quirks, a demographic the school had historically struggled to serve given the overwhelming majority of its curriculum built around quirk-based combat and rescue training, requested his direct involvement in developing a new supplementary program specifically designed to identify and cultivate exactly the kind of disciplined, foundational capability that had once carried a quirkless boy through 5 years of secret training before any quirk had ever entered the picture. Izuku accepted the invitation without hesitation, recognizing in it an opportunity that felt, in its own way, like the natural continuation of everything Shadow's original gift to him had ultimately represented. He devoted considerable personal time in the months that followed to developing the program's curriculum, drawing directly on the accumulated lessons of his own extraordinary training, translating Shadow's exacting philosophy of discipline and repetition into a structured approach that other quirkless or underpowered students might follow without needing the singular, unlikely fortune of a talking hedgehog appearing on a park bench to guide them through it personally. "I want this to be something replicable," Izuku explained to Aizawa, the two of them reviewing an early draft of the curriculum in the same UA classroom where Izuku had once sat as an uncertain first-year student himself. "Not everyone is going to have what I had. But the principles underneath it, the idea that discipline can build a foundation strong enough to carry someone even without a quirk, or with a quirk that doesn't naturally lend itself to combat, that part doesn't require luck. It just requires someone willing to teach it properly, and someone willing to do the work." Aizawa, reviewing the draft with his characteristic thorough attention, offered a rare, genuine nod of approval. "This is good work," he said. "I'll admit, when the administration first proposed reaching out to you for this, I wondered whether you'd have the time, given everything else your career has grown into. I'm glad you made the time regardless. This is exactly the kind of contribution the school has been missing." The program's pilot cohort, drawn from a careful selection process designed to identify students whose circumstances most closely mirrored Izuku's own early challenges, included, among its dozen initial participants, a serious, quiet 11-year-old girl named Hana Fujimori, quirkless in the precise, absolute sense of the diagnosis, whose application essay, reviewed by Izuku personally during the selection process, described an ambition to become a hero with a clarity and determination that struck him with an immediate, powerful sense of recognition. "I don't have anything special," Hana had written, in the essay's closing lines. "But I don't think that means I can't become someone special anyway. I just need someone to show me how." Izuku read that closing sentence more times than he could easily count, the echo of his own long-ago desperation and hope settling into him with a weight that felt, in its own way, like the closing of a circle nearly a decade in the making. Chapter 56. He met Hana Fujimori for the first time on the program's opening day, a small, serious girl with careful, watchful eyes who reminded him, in ways he found himself unable to fully articulate even to Momo that evening, powerfully and immediately of the boy he had once been, sitting alone on a park bench with a notebook and a fragile, desperate hope that his life might someday amount to more than a diagnosis. "You're really Izuku Midoriya," Hana said, during their first individual meeting, her voice carrying a careful, guarded wonder that suggested she had not fully allowed herself to believe, until this exact moment, that the invitation to this program represented a genuine opportunity rather than some elaborate, eventual disappointment. "I read about you. About how you didn't have a quirk either, before everything else happened." "I didn't," Izuku confirmed. "Not for the first 14 years of my life. I trained for 5 of those years without any expectation that a quirk would ever come. I want you to understand that clearly, before we start any of this. Everything I'm going to teach you works whether or not a quirk ever arrives. It worked for me before One for All. It's going to work for you regardless of what your own future eventually holds." Hana absorbed this with the same careful, serious attention she brought to everything, and Izuku recognized, watching her process the information, the particular hunger of a child who had spent considerable time being told, by circumstance and often by people who should have known better, that her worth was contingent on something she did not control. Why does it matter to you? Hana finally asked. Teaching this. You're already the strongest hero in the country. You don't need to spend your time on some kid who might never amount to anything. Izuku considered the question with the same careful seriousness he brought to every significant conversation, recognizing in it an opportunity to offer this frightened, hopeful girl something he wished, in his own darkest years, someone had offered him sooner. Because someone once decided I was worth the effort, before I had any proof I would ever amount to anything, he said. A stranger, who had no obligation to me at all, looked at a lonely, quirkless boy and decided that discipline and belief could build something worth building, even without a gift handed out for free. I wouldn't be standing here today without that decision. I intend to keep making the same decision, for as many kids like you as I possibly can, for exactly as long as I'm able. Something in Hana's careful, guarded expression shifted at that answer, a small, cautious hope beginning to surface beneath the wariness that had clearly been years in the making, and Izuku, recognizing the fragile, significant moment for exactly what it was, offered her the same simple promise Shadow had once offered him beside a different park bench, in a different but essentially unchanged season of the world. I'm not going anywhere, he told her. Whatever this training asks of you, however long it takes, I intend to see it through to the end, right alongside you. Chapter 57. The months that followed carried Izuku through a training regimen with Hana Fujimori that echoed, in its careful, deliberate structure, the exact philosophy Shadow had first built into him nearly a decade earlier, though refined now through years of accumulated professional insight into something more systematic and considerably better documented than the improvised, instinctive lessons Shadow had originally offered a desperate, untested boy. Hana proved, across those early months, to carry a stubborn, quiet determination that reminded Izuku, more than once, powerfully of himself, absorbing the physical demands of the program's rigorous conditioning with a discipline that surprised even the program's other instructors, several of whom had initially expressed private skepticism about a fully quirkless 11-year-old's realistic prospects within a curriculum designed, at its foundation, for future combat-capable heroes. She's going to surprise all of you, Izuku told the program's skeptical staff, during one of the pilot cohort's early progress reviews, his voice carrying the calm, settled confidence of someone who recognized, in Hana's particular quality of stubbornness, something he understood intimately from the inside. I know what that specific kind of refusal to quit actually produces, given enough time and the right foundation. I've lived it myself. Give her the same chance someone once gave me, and I don't think any of you are going to be disappointed. Shadow, informed of Izuku's new mentorship role during one of their now less frequent but still cherished evening meetings, absorbed the development with the particular, quiet satisfaction that had become, over the years, his most common response to watching Izuku's continued growth into a fuller version of everything their original training had built toward. You have become the exact thing I once was to you, Shadow observed, watching Izuku recount the details of Hana's early progress with an enthusiasm that carried unmistakable echoes of his own long-ago training sessions beside a different park bench. I confess I find a particular satisfaction in that, one I did not fully anticipate when I first decided a lonely, quirkless boy was worth the effort of building into something more. I did not merely build a hero. I built someone capable of extending the same gift forward, to someone else who needed it exactly as badly as you once did. Would you be willing to meet her? Izuku asked, the question carrying a hope he had been quietly holding for weeks now, unsure until this exact moment whether he would actually find the nerve to voice it aloud. Not to train her yourself. Just to meet her. I think it might mean something to her, knowing where all of this originally started. Shadow considered this for a long moment, his red eyes carrying the particular thoughtful weight he reserved for genuinely significant decisions. I do not make a habit of revealing myself to strangers, he said finally. But I do not consider a child you have chosen to invest this much of yourself in a stranger, not truly. I will meet her. On the condition that the meeting serves her genuine benefit, and not merely the sentimental satisfaction of closing some circle you have decided needs closing. Izuku, recognizing the characteristic dry precision beneath Shadow's careful agreement, felt a warmth settle into him that carried the full, accumulated weight of nearly a decade of evolving partnership between them. That's exactly why I'm asking, he said. I think meeting you might genuinely teach her something important and lasting about what's actually possible that I simply cannot fully teach her on my own, no matter how hard I try. Chapter 58. The meeting took place on a quiet Saturday afternoon at the same familiar park by the river that had witnessed the entirety of Izuku's own extraordinary beginning, Hana arriving with her mother, a tired but visibly hopeful woman whose own careful watchfulness suggested years of the same anxious protectiveness Izuku Midoriya had once carried for her own quirkless son, and finding, waiting for them on the low stone wall, a black and red hedgehog whose presence, once explained, left both mother and daughter briefly and entirely speechless. "You're really him," Hana said finally, once she had recovered enough composure to speak. "The one from all the stories. The one who trained Izuku Midoriya before he had any power at all." "I am," Shadow confirmed, studying her with the same flat, evaluating attention he had once turned on a much younger Izuku in this exact spot. "Izuku tells me you are stubborn. That you refuse to accept limitation as a final answer, even when circumstance suggests you should." "That's what he keeps telling me too," Hana said, a small, uncertain smile beginning to surface. "I don't always believe him, though. Sometimes it feels like I'm just pretending to believe it, so he doesn't stop trying to help me." Shadow considered this admission with unusual care, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a gentleness Izuku had rarely heard him extend to anyone outside their own long, treasured history together. "I once trained a boy who felt exactly the way you are describing," Shadow said. "He did not believe, for a very long time, that the discipline I was building into him would ever amount to anything beyond simple survival. He continued the work anyway, because continuing felt marginally better than the alternative of giving up entirely. It was only years later, looking back, that he understood the belief had never actually been the necessary ingredient. The continuing was. Belief, when it eventually arrives, is simply the reward for having continued long enough to earn it." Hana absorbed this with the same careful, serious attention she brought to everything, and something in her posture, watching Shadow speak with the particular directness that had once, years earlier, reached through a much younger Izuku's own careful despair, seemed to settle and strengthen in a way her mother, watching from a short distance away, visibly noticed and was visibly moved by. "Will you tell me more?" Hana asked. "About how you trained him. What it actually looked like, day to day, before he was anyone important." Shadow's answering expression carried something that might, in a being less committed to careful reserve, have been read as genuine warmth. "I will tell you what I told him on our very first evening together," Shadow said. "Power is not something you are born with. Power is something you take. I have watched beings born with abilities that could level cities waste them because they never learned discipline, and I have watched beings born with nothing carve their names into history because they refused to accept the word cannot. I do not know yet which one you are going to be. But I intend to find out, if you are willing to do the work required to discover it." Izuku, standing a short distance away beside Hana's watchful, hopeful mother, felt the full weight of the moment settle into him with a significance that carried, in equal measure, the accumulated gratitude of everything his own long journey had built and the quiet, powerful satisfaction of watching that same gift extend outward, deliberately and completely, into a future he would not have to build alone. Chapter 59. The following year brought Hana Fujimori's training through the same demanding, transformative arc that had once carried a much younger Izuku from frightened uncertainty toward genuine, hard-won capability, and Izuku found himself, watching her progress unfold week by week, understanding Shadow's original patience and exacting discipline with a depth of appreciation that only direct experience on the other side of the teaching relationship could have ever fully provided. Hana struggled, in the program's early months, with precisely the frustrations Izuku remembered carrying himself, the humiliation of a body that could not yet do what her mind demanded of it, the ache of comparing her own slower, more difficult progress against classmates whose natural quirks offered them advantages her own quirkless foundation could never match through raw gift alone. Izuku met each of these struggles with the same patient, exacting correction Shadow had once offered him, refusing to soften the genuine difficulty of the work while never once allowing that difficulty to curdle into discouragement. "You are not competing against them," Izuku told her, during a particularly difficult evening session when Hana's frustration at a repeatedly failed drill had finally boiled over into tears she seemed embarrassed to be shedding in front of him. You are competing against the version of yourself from yesterday. That is the only comparison that has ever actually mattered, in any of this. I promise you, the version of yourself from a year from now is going to look back at this exact moment and recognize it as the beginning of something, not the proof of some limitation you were always going to be stuck with. Hana, wiping at her eyes with the particular embarrassed fierceness of a child unwilling to be seen as fragile, absorbed this with the same serious attention she brought to everything Izuku offered her. How do you know that? She asked. How did you know, back when you were the one struggling, that it was actually going to work out? I didn't know, Izuku admitted honestly. Not for certain. I just decided that continuing felt better than the alternative, exactly the way Shadow told you it did. Certainty came later, once there was enough evidence behind me to actually support it. I can't promise you certainty right now either. I can only promise you that the work is worth doing regardless of whether the certainty ever fully arrives, and that I'm not going anywhere while you find that out for yourself. The months that followed brought steady, incremental progress that mirrored, in its patient accumulation, the exact shape of Izuku's own early training, Hana's physical conditioning gradually strengthening, her tactical understanding deepening, her natural stubbornness, once a source of frustration even to herself, slowly transforming into the genuine, disciplined resilience that Izuku recognized, watching her, as the same essential quality Shadow had once identified and cultivated in him. Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako each found their own ways to support Hana's development alongside Izuku's direct mentorship, Momo offering occasional tutoring sessions in the tactical and academic material the program's broader curriculum demanded, Tsuyu providing patient, practical guidance on the specific physical conditioning exercises her own specialization best suited her to teach, Ochako simply offering the warm, steady friendship of an adult who had herself once been an uncertain, striving student navigating UA's demanding expectations. She reminds me of you in more ways than just the training, Ochako observed to Izuku one evening, the two of them watching Hana work through a particularly demanding drill with the same fierce, quiet determination that had first caught Izuku's attention in her application essay. That same refusal to complain even when something is clearly hurting. That same instinct to just keep going rather than ask for the easier path. I see it too, Izuku said. I don't know whether that makes me want to push her harder or protect her more carefully. Maybe both, somehow, at the same time. Chapter 60. Hana's first genuine test arrived nearly 18 months into her training, during a routine field observation exercise the program organized to give its most advanced participants limited, carefully supervised exposure to genuine, if minor, hero work under close professional oversight. Izuku, serving as her direct supervising mentor for the exercise, watched with a mixture of pride and carefully controlled anxiety as Hana, now considerably stronger and more capable than the frightened, uncertain girl who had first arrived at the program's opening day, moved through the exercise's structured scenarios with a growing, hard-won confidence. The exercise's planned parameters, however, were disrupted partway through by an unplanned, genuine emergency, a small structure fire in a nearby residential building whose severity, while modest by the standards of Izuku's usual professional work, nonetheless represented exactly the kind of unplanned, high-stakes crisis the program's careful supervision structure was specifically designed to shield its youngest participants from direct involvement in. Izuku moved immediately to secure the scene and begin evacuation procedures, and it was in the midst of that response that he became aware, with a sharp and immediate concern, that Hana had not remained at the designated safe distance the exercise's protocols required, instead moving, on her own initiative, toward a side entrance where a trapped elderly resident's frightened calls for help had drawn her forward before conscious deliberation could catch up with instinct. Hana, wait, Izuku called, already moving to intercept her, but found, reaching her side, that she had already begun the careful, methodical work of clearing a path through the building's obstructed entrance, applying, with a precision that startled him even in the moment's urgency, exactly the kind of controlled, disciplined technique 18 months of careful training had built into her reflexes. I've got this, Hana said, her voice carrying a fierce, focused calm that Izuku recognized, with a jolt of powerful recognition, as an unmistakable echo of his own long-ago instincts in the alley behind a convenience store, facing a sludge villain with nothing but discipline and desperate hope to carry him through it. I can do this. You taught me how. Izuku, torn between the urgent need to protect his young student from genuine danger and the equally urgent recognition that stopping her now might undo something significant in the fragile, hard-won confidence 18 months of careful training had built, made the rapid, difficult decision to remain close beside her rather than physically remove her from the situation, ready to intervene at the first genuine sign that the crisis exceeded her actual capability, but trusting, in that critical moment, the accumulated evidence of everything she had already demonstrated she could handle. Together, they cleared the obstructed entrance and reached the trapped resident, an elderly woman whose panic had made the confined space considerably more dangerous than the fire itself, and Hana, working alongside Izuku with a coordinated efficiency that belied her young age and limited experience, helped guide the frightened woman to safety with a calm, steady competence that drew, once the crisis had fully resolved, immediate and considerable praise from the program's senior supervising staff. "You broke protocol," one of the program's more cautious instructors told Hana afterward, though the assessment carried more concern than genuine reprimand. "You could have been seriously hurt, acting without authorization like that." "I know," Hana said, her voice carrying none of the defensive defiance the instructor's tone might have provoked in a less grounded student, only calm, considered honesty. "But someone needed help, and I knew I could do something about it. I wasn't going to just stand there and wait for permission while she was scared and alone." Izuku, watching the exchange with a swell of complicated, powerful pride, found himself recognizing, in Hana's simple, unhesitating answer, the exact same instinct that had once carried him toward a trapped child in an alley behind a convenience store, 5 years of secret training compressed into a single, decisive action that had changed the entire trajectory of his life. Chapter 61. That evening, walking Hana and her visibly shaken but proud mother home from the program's facility, Izuku found himself reflecting, with a depth he had not fully anticipated, on the particular weight of watching someone he had chosen to mentor make exactly the kind of decision that had once defined the beginning of his own extraordinary journey. "You did something incredibly brave today," Izuku told Hana, as they walked together through the cooling evening air. "I want you to understand that clearly, separate from whatever the program's official protocols have to say about it. You saw someone who needed help, and you had the training and the courage to actually provide it. That instinct, the willingness to act rather than wait, is not something every hero candidate develops, no matter how much raw power or quirk capability they might otherwise carry. You have it. I saw it, today, as clearly as I've ever seen anything." Hana, walking beside him with the particular quiet glow of a child who had just received validation she had not fully realized she was still waiting for, considered this for a long moment before responding. "Is that how it started for you?" she asked. "The real training. Not just the drills, but the actual, real thing." "It is," Izuku confirmed. "There was a villain, and a trapped child, and I didn't think about it, I just moved. 5 years of training with Shadow made that decision for me, before my conscious mind had even finished processing what was happening. I think that might be the actual point of everything the discipline builds toward. Not just strength for its own sake, but the kind of instinct that moves toward danger instead of away from it, when someone else genuinely needs that movement." Hana's mother, walking a step behind them, offered her own quiet, grateful addition to the conversation. "I used to worry," she admitted, "that wanting this for her, wanting her to become a hero despite everything the diagnosis suggested about her limitations, was somehow setting her up for disappointment. Watching today, watching what she actually did when it mattered, I don't worry about that anymore. I think you've given her something considerably more valuable than just training. You've given her proof that the diagnosis was never actually the whole story." Izuku, hearing words that carried an unmistakable echo of his own mother's long-ago fears and eventual, hard-won peace, felt the full weight of the moment settle into him with the particular gravity of a circle nearly a decade in the making finally, completely closing. Shadow, informed of the day's events during their next evening meeting, absorbed the account with his characteristic careful attention, and when he finally responded, his voice carried an unmistakable, genuine warmth that had grown, across the years, into something Izuku had learned to treasure above almost any other measure of approval available to him. "You have built something remarkable," Shadow said. "Not merely a career, or a reputation, or even the family you have grown around yourself across these years. You have built a legacy capable of extending forward, beyond the reach of your own direct effort, into the lives of people who needed exactly what you once needed yourself. I did not fully anticipate, 7 years ago, sitting beside a park bench with a grieving, quirkless boy, that the discipline I was building into him would eventually multiply outward this completely. I find myself, watching it happen, more satisfied than I have words to properly express. Izuku, standing in the familiar evening dark beside the being who had shaped nearly the entirety of his own extraordinary transformation, felt the accumulated weight of the entire journey, from a lonely boy on a park bench to a mentor watching his own students' courage unfold in real time, settle into something he recognized, without any remaining reservation, as the fullest and most complete expression yet of everything 7 years of patient, disciplined faith had ultimately been building toward. Chapter 62. Word arrived, some months later, of a significant threat building along the nation's northern coastline, a small but determined faction that had splintered away from the League of Villains' original ideology years earlier, calling themselves by a new name and pursuing a considerably more focused, less chaotic agenda than their predecessors, the deliberate, systematic targeting of the very hero training institutions, UA chief among them, that the faction's leadership blamed for perpetuating what they characterized as an unjust, quirk supremacist social order. The threat's escalating activity, tracked with growing concern by national intelligence agencies over the preceding months, culminated in a coordinated plot to disrupt a major inter-school hero training exhibition, an event that would gather students and faculty from UA and several allied institutions in a single, concentrated location, precisely the kind of high-value, symbolically significant target the faction's ideology had made clear it considered worth the risk of direct confrontation. Izuku, alerted to the specific threat through his continued close relationship with UA's administration, found himself drawn into the security planning for the exhibition with an urgency sharpened considerably by the uncomfortable awareness that Hana, along with the rest of the mentorship program's most advanced participants, was scheduled to attend as part of the event's showcase of the program's developing capabilities. I don't want her anywhere near genuine danger, Izuku told Aizawa, during one of the tense planning sessions that preceded the exhibition, his usual careful composure carrying an unmistakable edge of personal, protective urgency. She's made incredible progress. But she's still 18 months into training that took me 5 years to complete. I won't have her exposed to something her preparation genuinely isn't ready for yet. Aizawa, reviewing the security plan's details with his characteristic thorough attention, offered a measured, practical response. The security coverage for this event is going to be more extensive than nearly anything UA has organized in the years since the assault on our own campus, he said. You'll be there personally. Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako as well, given their own standing relationship with the school. I understand the personal weight of what you're asking. But excluding the program's participants entirely sends its own message, one that suggests the very demographic this program was built to serve should retreat rather than participate simply because a threat exists. I don't think that's the lesson either of us actually wants her to learn. Izuku considered this with the same careful, difficult weighing of competing priorities that had defined so many of his most significant decisions across the preceding years, and found himself, in the end, unable to fully disagree with Aizawa's underlying logic, however much the protective instinct still pulled against it. I'll be with her personally, throughout the entire event, Izuku said finally. If anything even approaches the threshold of genuine danger, she's out, immediately, no discussion. But you're right that pulling her out entirely, purely on the basis of precaution, teaches her something I don't actually want her carrying forward. The exhibition proceeded, in its opening hours, with the careful, orchestrated normalcy the extensive security planning had been designed to project, students from across the participating institutions demonstrating their developing capabilities before a gathered audience of faculty, families, and invited hero community observers, and Izuku found himself, watching Hana's own confident, steadily improving demonstration of the foundational discipline he had spent 18 months building into her. Allowing himself, cautiously, to hope that the day's careful precautions might prove, in the end, unnecessary. Chapter 63. That hope collapsed in the exhibition's late afternoon hours, the faction's coordinated attack arriving with a precision and organization that immediately confirmed every concern the preceding weeks of intelligence gathering had raised, multiple simultaneous breaches across the event's carefully secured perimeter overwhelming the initial layer of security response before the more experienced pro-heroes present, Izuku prominently among them, could fully mobilize a coordinated counter. Izuku's first, immediate priority remained locating Hana amid the exhibition ground's sudden, chaotic disruption, and he found her, within minutes of the attack's opening moments, exactly where their agreed contingency plan had specified, sheltering with a small cluster of other program participants in a designated secure zone, frightened but disciplined, exactly as her training had prepared her to be. "Stay here," Izuku told her, the urgency of the moment cutting through whatever gentler instruction the circumstances might otherwise have allowed. "This zone is secured. I need to help contain the breach before it reaches any of you directly. I will come back for you the moment this is resolved. I promise you that." Hana, her fear visible but her composure holding with the same disciplined resolve that had first impressed the program's skeptical staff months earlier, nodded firmly. "I trust you," she said simply, and Izuku, moving to rejoin the exhibition's broader defensive response, carried that simple, powerful trust with him into the confrontation that followed. The fighting that unfolded across the exhibition grounds tested Izuku, Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako's accumulated years of partnership more severely than nearly any confrontation since their early professional careers, the faction's coordinated operatives demonstrating a discipline and tactical sophistication that echoed, uncomfortably, the same patient, deliberate planning that had characterized their organization's original ideological founding years earlier. The four of them fell into their familiar, seamless coordination nonetheless, dividing the ground's multiple breach points with the same practiced efficiency that had carried them through every prior crisis of their shared professional history. It was during this sprawling, coordinated defense that Izuku became aware, through a sharp, urgent alert relayed from the exhibition's security coordination, that the secure zone sheltering Hana and the other program participants had come under direct, targeted pressure. A small cell of the faction's operatives apparently recognizing the symbolic value of directly threatening the very demographic the exhibition's mentorship showcase had been designed to celebrate. Izuku broke from his assigned section of the defense the instant the alert reached him, covering the distance toward the secure zone with a speed that drew on every reserve of trained urgency 7 years of accumulated crisis response had built into his deepest instincts, and arrived to find the zone's designated security holding, barely, against the pressing threat. The program's young participants sheltered but visibly, understandably terrified by the direct proximity of genuine, coordinated danger. Chapter 64. The confrontation that followed tested Izuku more severely than nearly anything since the League's original assault on UA years earlier, the faction's operatives fighting with a disciplined, coordinated ferocity that reflected the same patient, ideologically driven planning that had brought them to this exact confrontation, and Izuku, moving to intercept the threat before it could reach any closer to the sheltering children, drew on the full, integrated combination of Shadow's discipline and One for All's accumulated power that 7 years of continuous refinement had built into something approaching seamless, instinctive mastery. He was not fighting alone for long. Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, alerted to the secure zone's crisis through the same urgent coordination that had first reached Izuku, arrived in rapid succession, the four of them falling into the same practiced, seamless partnership that had carried them through every significant crisis of their shared professional history, their combined efficiency finally, decisively turning the tide of the confrontation. The faction's operatives, faced now with the coordinated resistance of 4 of the nation's most capable young heroes, breaking off their assault and retreating rather than continue pressing an engagement that had become too costly to sustain. In the tense, adrenaline-charged aftermath, as the broader exhibition ground's chaos finally began to settle under the arriving weight of additional reinforcements, Izuku found Hana exactly where he had left her, shaken but unharmed, her composure, tested now by genuine and considerable danger, holding with a resilience that struck him, even amid the day's accumulated exhaustion, as remarkable. "You came back," Hana said, her voice carrying a fierce, relieved gratitude that needed no further elaboration. "I told you I would," Izuku said, kneeling beside her to confirm, with quick, practiced hands, that she carried no injury from the confrontation's proximity. "Are you all right?" "I'm okay," Hana confirmed, though her voice carried a visible tremor that the day's genuine danger had understandably provoked. "I was scared. But I remembered what you taught me. Stay disciplined. Trust the training. Trust that someone's coming. Izuku, absorbing the simple, powerful trust embedded in her answer, felt the accumulated weight of the entire day, the careful planning and the sudden crisis and the desperate, urgent fight to reach her in time, settle into something that carried, beneath its exhaustion, a profound and complete gratitude that circumstance had allowed him to fulfill the promise he had made her. The exhibition's full accounting, once the crisis had fully resolved and the faction's remaining operatives had either been captured or driven into retreat, revealed injuries among several participants and security personnel but, remarkably, no fatalities, a fact the gathered administration attributed, in the extensive debriefing that followed, in significant part to the rapid, coordinated response Izuku and his partners had mounted, and to the disciplined, trained composure the program's young participants had themselves demonstrated under genuinely terrifying circumstances. Hana's mother, arriving at the secure evacuation point to find her daughter shaken but safe, embraced her with a fierce, relieved gratitude before turning to Izuku with an expression that carried, beneath its visible fear, an unmistakable and complete trust. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying a weight that needed no further elaboration between them. "I promised her I wouldn't let anything happen," Izuku said. "I intend to keep that promise for as long as she needs me to." Shadow, present at the exhibition's edges throughout the crisis in his characteristic careful, unobtrusive manner, found Izuku in the settling aftermath, and offered, in place of his usual dry commentary, a small, genuine nod that carried, in its quiet economy, the full weight of 9 years of shared history and everything the day's events had ultimately demonstrated about how completely that history had shaped the man standing before him. "You protected her the way I once protected you," Shadow observed. "Not merely with strength, but with the discipline to hold steady exactly when holding steady mattered most. I do not believe there is any higher measure of what our years of training together were always actually meant to become." Chapter 65. The weeks following the exhibition attack brought their own careful, necessary process of recovery, both for the broader hero community grappling with the re-emergence of ideologically driven violence years after the League's original shattering, and for Hana herself, whose composed, disciplined response during the crisis had not fully insulated her from the more complicated emotional aftermath that genuine, close proximity to danger inevitably produced in even the most carefully trained young person. Izuku made certain, in the weeks that followed, to remain closely present in Hana's continued processing of the experience, drawing on his own hard-won understanding of exactly how genuine crisis could linger in unexpected ways long after the immediate danger itself had passed. He recognized, in her occasional withdrawn quiet during their continued training sessions, in the small flinch that sometimes crossed her expression at unexpected loud noises, the same kind of lingering aftermath he himself had once carried following the USJ attack, years earlier, as a considerably younger and less experienced student. "It's all right if this is still sitting with you," Izuku told her, during one particularly quiet session where Hana's usual focused determination had visibly given way to something more fragile and uncertain. "What happened was genuinely frightening, and being frightened afterward doesn't undo any of the courage you showed in the moment itself. I still carry my own version of this, from things that happened years before you ever met me. It doesn't make either of us weaker. It just makes us honest about what real danger actually costs, even when we come through it all right." Hana, considering this with the same serious attention she brought to everything Izuku offered her, found herself, gradually across the following weeks, working through the lingering weight of the experience with a resilience that Izuku recognized, watching her, as its own significant form of the exact discipline the program had spent nearly 2 years building into her. She did not rush the process, and Izuku, mindful of every lesson his own recovery from similar experiences had taught him, made certain not to rush her either, allowing the careful, patient work of genuine healing the same disciplined attention he had always applied to every other dimension of her training. Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako each offered their own steady, complementary support throughout this period, Momo helping Hana process the crisis through the same rigorous, analytical framework she applied to her own difficult experiences, breaking the overwhelming whole into manageable, understandable pieces, Tsuyu offering the same calm, grounding presence that had carried Izuku through his own most difficult moments across the preceding years, Ochako providing the warm, unguarded emotional support that complemented the other's more structured approaches with its own essential, comforting simplicity. You have quite a support system, Hana observed, during one of the group's now regular gatherings that had, over the preceding months, come to include her as something closer to an honorary member of their close, extended family than simply Izuku's individual student. I didn't think heroes were supposed to need this much help just to feel okay again. Every hero needs this, Ochako told her, gently but firmly. The ones who pretend they don't are usually the ones who end up struggling the most, later, when the weight finally catches up with them. Needing help doesn't make you less capable. It makes you honest about what it actually costs to do this work well, and smart enough to build the support that lets you keep doing it. Momo, listening to the exchange with her usual thoughtful attention, offered her own considered addition. I think there's a version of this lesson that took me longer to learn than I'd like to admit, she said. For a long time I thought needing people made me somehow less rigorous, less capable of standing on my own credentials. It took watching Izuku, and watching the four of us build what we'd built together, to understand that the two things were never actually in competition. The strongest people I know are the ones who let themselves be supported, not the ones who insist on carrying everything alone out of some misplaced sense of what strength is supposed to look like. Tsuyu, settling comfortably nearby, added her own quiet, practical observation. It's the same as training your body, she said. You don't get stronger by refusing rest. You get stronger by working hard and then letting the recovery actually happen. Emotional weight isn't so different, once you really look at it. Pretending you don't need to process something difficult just delays the reckoning. It doesn't prevent it. Hana absorbed each of these observations with the same careful, serious attention she brought to everything the group offered her, and Izuku, watching her slowly integrate the accumulated wisdom of four people who had each, in their own way, learned similar lessons through considerable hard-won experience, felt a quiet satisfaction settle into him at the sight of exactly the kind of support network he had once needed so badly himself, now extending itself naturally around someone new. Chapter 66. Hana's continued development across the following year brought her, eventually, to the program's culminating milestone examination, a comprehensive assessment designed to evaluate whether its participants had built a foundation genuinely sufficient to support continued advancement into UA's standard hero course curriculum, and Izuku found himself, watching her prepare for the assessment with the same fierce, disciplined focus that had carried her through every prior challenge of her training. Experiencing an echo of the same complicated, powerful pride he imagined Shadow must have once carried, watching a much younger Izuku prepare for his own UA entrance examination years earlier, a full circle he found himself dwelling on more than once during the weeks of preparation that followed. The assessment itself, a comprehensive evaluation spanning physical conditioning, tactical reasoning, and a supervised practical scenario testing genuine crisis response capability, tested Hana more thoroughly than any prior challenge of her 2 years within the program, and Izuku, present as an observer rather than a direct participant in the formal evaluation, found himself holding attention he rarely allowed himself to carry into other people's trials, the accumulated investment of 2 years of careful, deliberate mentorship settling into a hope he found difficult to fully contain. Hana met the assessment's demands with a composed, disciplined competence that drew, across its various stages, increasingly impressed acknowledgement from the evaluating panel. Her physical conditioning, once a source of visible struggle during the program's early months, now carrying the settled, integrated strength of genuine, hard-won mastery, her tactical reasoning demonstrating the careful, patient analytical habits Izuku had spent 2 years deliberately cultivating in her. The assessment's final results, delivered several days later through the same formal channels that had once carried Izuku's own UA acceptance years earlier, confirmed Hana's successful advancement into UA's standard hero course curriculum, a genuine, remarkable achievement for a student who had entered the mentorship program as a frightened, uncertain 11-year-old with nothing but stubborn determination and a fragile, desperate hope to carry her forward. The evaluating panel's written assessment, which Izuku read afterward with considerable satisfaction, noted specifically her exceptional composure under pressure and the unusual maturity of her tactical reasoning for a student of her age and relatively limited formal training history, observations that struck Izuku as a fitting, if understated, tribute to everything the preceding 2 years had actually built into her. I did it, Hana said, staring at the acceptance notification with an expression that mixed disbelief and overwhelming, unguarded joy. the same complicated cocktail of emotion Izuku remembered carrying himself, years earlier, staring at his own acceptance into Yui's hero course for the very first time, notebook clutched against his chest exactly the way Hana now clutched her own notification against hers. You did it, Izuku confirmed, feeling his own eyes carry an unexpected, powerful sting of emotion at the sight of her joy. Every bit of it, through your own discipline and your own refusal to quit. I just showed you the path. You're the one who actually walked it. Hana's mother, present for the celebration that followed, found Izuku amid the gathering's warm chaos with an expression carrying the particular, complete gratitude of a parent who had once carried fears she had scarcely allowed herself to fully articulate, watching her daughter's uncertain, quirkless future finally, completely transform into genuine, hard-won possibility, a transformation she had, in her quietest and most honest moments, once feared she would never actually get to witness. I don't know how to properly thank you for what you've given her, Hana's mother told him, her voice carrying an emotion she made no effort to fully contain. Not just the training. The belief. The proof that her worth was never actually contingent on something she didn't control. You don't need to thank me, Izuku said, gently but with complete sincerity. Someone once gave me exactly this same gift, without any expectation of repayment beyond the hope that I might eventually pass it forward to someone else who needed it. I'm just honoring that same debt, the only way it was ever actually meant to be honored, one student and one difficult, worthwhile year at a time. Chapter 67. On a quiet evening nearly a full decade after Shadow had first appeared beside a lonely, grieving boy on a park bench, and exactly 10 years after that same boy had first sat down on the exact same bench with nothing but a notebook and a fragile, desperate hope, Izuku Midoriya found himself walking, once again, the familiar path back toward that treasured, unchanged stretch of Riverside Park, this time accompanied by Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, and, for the first time, by Hana Fujimori as well. Now a confident, capable first-year student at UA High School, her own extraordinary journey only just beginning even as Izuku's continued to unfold around her. They found Shadow already there, perched on the same low stone wall in the same watchful stillness that had first caught a grieving boy's attention more than a decade earlier, and the gathering that followed carried a warmth and completeness that Izuku, settling onto the familiar bench beside the people who had shaped nearly the entirety of his extraordinary life, found himself struggling to fully put into adequate words. I keep thinking about how this all started, Izuku said, looking out over the quiet river in the gathering evening light, Hana settling nearby with the particular, careful reverence of someone standing at the edge of something she understood to be genuinely significant. One conversation, on this exact bench, with a stranger who had no obligation to help a frightened, quirkless boy at all. Everything since then, all of it, traces back to that single choice, made on an ordinary evening that could just as easily have passed like any other. It does, Shadow agreed. And I find myself, watching the shape this evening has taken, considering something I did not fully anticipate all those years ago. I did not merely change the trajectory of one boy's life. I set something in motion that has continued extending outward, year after year, into lives I never directly touched myself. Hana would not have found her way to this program, to this training, to the future now opening in front of her, without the specific chain of choices that began on this exact bench, more than a decade ago, choices I made without ever once imagining how far their consequences might eventually travel. Hana, listening to this exchange with the same serious, careful attention she brought to everything significant in her life, found her own voice for the first time since the gathering had settled. I think about that too, she admitted. How strange it is, that I'm here at all, because a stranger once decided a different quirkless kid was worth the effort, years before I was even born into a family that would eventually need exactly this same kind of help. It makes me want to keep it going somehow. Whatever this actually is. I don't want it to stop with me, not after everything it's already given me. Izuku, hearing in her words an unmistakable echo of the same promise he had once made himself, felt the accumulated weight of the entire, extraordinary chain of choices settle into something he recognized, with complete and settled certainty, as considerably larger than any single life, his own included, a realization that carried its own quiet, humbling weight. It won't stop with you, Izuku told her. I don't think it was ever meant to. I think that's the actual lesson underneath everything Shadow built into me, all those years ago. Discipline doesn't just build one person. Given enough time and enough people willing to pass it forward, it builds something considerably larger than any single life could hold on its own, something that keeps reaching further than any of us could ever fully trace on our own. The evening deepened around them, the city's lights beginning to mirror the first emerging stars, and the six of them, the hero who had once been nothing but a quirkless boy with a notebook, the patient hedgehog who had first seen something worth building in him, the three remarkable people who had chosen, freely and completely, to walk the entire road beside him, and the newest link in a chain of deliberate, generous choice now extending forward into a future none of them could fully see the shape of yet, remained together beside the quiet river long into the gathering dark, exactly where the whole extraordinary story had first begun, and exactly where, in every way that genuinely mattered, it would continue, unbroken, for as long as anyone remained willing to choose it, one honest evening, one deliberate choice, one grateful and unbroken generation at a time. Chapter 68. All Might, informed of Hana's successful advancement into UA's hero course and the broader significance of the mentorship program's pilot success, requested, through Izuku, the opportunity to meet the young student whose journey had so closely echoed the beginning of Izuku's own extraordinary story, and the meeting that followed, arranged for a quiet afternoon at the modest apartment All Might had called home since his retirement, carried its own significant, treasured weight for everyone involved. You are the first quirkless student to graduate from Izuku's program, All Might observed, settling across from Hana with the same warm, careful attention he had once extended to a much younger, more uncertain Izuku on a rooftop years earlier. I understand that distinction carries considerable significance, both for you personally and for what it demonstrates more broadly about the possibilities available to students who do not fit the conventional mold this profession has too often assumed was the only viable path forward. I don't feel like I did anything especially remarkable, Hana admitted, her characteristic careful honesty asserting itself even in the presence of someone whose reputation had once seemed, to her, as distant and mythical as any figure from a storybook. I just did the work Izuku showed me how to do. Every single day, even when it was hard, even when I wanted to quit. That, All Might said, gently but with unmistakable conviction, is precisely the remarkable part. The willingness to do difficult, unglamorous work consistently, day after day, without any guarantee that it would ultimately amount to anything, that is the actual foundation every genuine hero, myself included, has ultimately been built upon. Quirks, when they exist, simply add to that foundation. They were never meant to replace the necessity of building it in the first place. The conversation that followed carried Hana through a version of All Might's own extraordinary history that he had, across the years, grown considerably more comfortable sharing openly, the sacrifice and discipline that had shaped his own singular path offering her a broader, richer understanding of the tradition she had, through Izuku's mentorship, now become a genuine part of. She listened with the same serious, careful attention she brought to everything significant in her young life, and Izuku, watching the exchange unfold, felt the accumulated warmth of an entire extended family, built across years of deliberate, honest choice, continuing to extend itself outward into a future that felt, more with each passing year, genuinely and completely secure. Shadow, present for a portion of the visit in his characteristic careful, unobtrusive manner, offered his own quiet observation once the afternoon's conversation had settled into its later, more relaxed rhythm. It is a peculiar thing, watching a legacy take shape in real time, Shadow said, addressing the comment as much to himself as to anyone else present. I did not fully anticipate, all those years ago, that training one grieving boy would eventually produce this particular constellation, a retired symbol of peace, a mother's steady, unwavering love, three remarkable partners, and now a new student carrying the same foundational discipline forward into her own unwritten future. I find, watching it all gathered in a single room, that I am considerably more sentimental about the outcome than I would have predicted, all those years ago, when sentiment was not a quality I generally permitted myself to indulge. Izuku's mother, arriving later that same evening to complete the gathering with the particular warmth she brought to every significant occasion in her son's life, found in Hana's presence a poignant, moving echo of her own long-ago fears and eventual, complete peace, and the two of them, mother and mentee's mother, found themselves, across the course of the evening, forming their own quiet, sympathetic bond built from the shared experience of watching a beloved, quirkless child transform. Against every early expectation, into someone capable of extraordinary things. I remember exactly how you're feeling right now, Inko told Hana's mother, the two of them sharing a quiet corner of the gathering while the younger members of the group continued their own animated conversation nearby. That specific mixture of relief and terror and overwhelming pride, watching your child do something you spent years afraid they'd never get the chance to do. It doesn't fully go away, even once they've proven themselves capable, again and again. You just learn to carry it alongside the pride, instead of letting it override everything else. How did you manage it? Hana's mother asked, watching Izuku across the room, deep in an animated conversation with All Might and Hana both, the ease and warmth of the exchange carrying no visible trace of the frightened, isolated boy his mother had once worried might never find exactly this kind of belonging. Watching him grow into all of this, knowing every step of the way that the danger was real, that you couldn't actually protect him from all of it no matter how much you wanted to. I trusted the people who chose to walk beside him, Inko said simply. Shadow, and later All Might, and eventually Momo and Tsuyu and Ochako too. I couldn't build the discipline or the power myself. But I could trust the people who did, and I could make certain my son always knew he had somewhere safe to come home to, no matter what the world outside asked of him. I think that's the actual job, for parents like us. Not preventing the danger. Building the foundation strong enough that they can face it and still come home whole. The evening deepened around the gathered family, old and new alike, and Izuku, catching his mother's eye across the warm, crowded room, felt the full and complete weight of everything the preceding decade had built settle into something he understood now, with complete and unshakable certainty, would continue extending forward, generously and deliberately, for as long as there remained people willing to choose it, one honest, difficult, worthwhile step at a time. Chapter 69. In the years that followed, the mentorship program Izuku had helped build expanded well beyond its modest pilot cohort, growing into a fixture of UA's broader curriculum that drew, each year, a new group of quirkless or underpowered students whose circumstances mirrored, in their own distinct ways, the frightened uncertainty a much younger Izuku had once carried alone. He continued serving as the program's guiding figure even as his own professional career continued its steady, considerable ascent, finding in the work a satisfaction that complemented, rather than competed with, everything else the preceding years had built into his rich and considered life. Hana's own journey through UA's standard hero course unfolded, in the years that followed, with the same disciplined, hard-won determination that had first carried her through the mentorship program's foundational training, and Izuku found himself, watching her progress from a respectful, appropriate distance now that she had transitioned fully into the school's standard curriculum, experiencing a particular, complicated pride that he imagined echoed something of what Shadow must have once felt watching his own progress unfold, years earlier, from a similar respectful remove. She graduated, eventually, into her own promising professional career, choosing, in a decision that moved Izuku considerably more than he expected when she first shared it with him, to specialize in exactly the kind of foundational, discipline-focused training methodology that had first carried her through her own uncertain beginnings, intent on becoming, in her own right, the kind of patient, exacting mentor that circumstance had once been generous enough to provide her. I want to do for someone else what you did for me, Hana told him, during a conversation shortly before her own graduation from UA, the two of them sharing a quiet moment at their now shared familiar spot by the river. I don't know yet who that's going to be. But I know I want to be ready, when the moment comes, the same way you were ready for me. Izuku, hearing in her words the unmistakable, generous continuation of everything Shadow's original gift had ultimately set in motion, felt the accumulated weight of an entire extraordinary legacy settle into something he understood now, with complete and unshakable certainty, would continue extending forward long after his own direct involvement had eventually, inevitably faded into the broader, richer history of everyone it had ultimately touched. The chain, once begun beside a quiet park bench more than a decade earlier, showed no sign of ending, each new link forged from the same essential materials that had first shaped Izuku's own extraordinary transformation, patient discipline, freely offered belief, and the deliberate, generous choice to see worth in someone before the world had offered any proof that worth existed. Izuku understood, watching Hana's own journey continue to unfold and watching the mentorship program's growing reach touch student after student who might otherwise have been told, by circumstance and by a world too often quick to define worth by narrow, inherited measures, that their futures were already decided, that this particular legacy represented, in its own quiet and unglamorous way, every bit as significant an achievement as any single confrontation or crisis his professional career had carried him through, and perhaps, in the end, the single achievement he had come to value most completely of all. Shadow, reflecting on this continuing pattern during one of their now treasured, unhurried evening conversations, offered his own final, characteristically understated assessment of everything the preceding years had ultimately built. "I offered you discipline, all those years ago," Shadow said. "I did not offer you a legacy. That part, the choice to extend what I gave you outward into other lives, was entirely and completely your own. I find, watching what has grown from that choice, that I could not be more satisfied with how thoroughly you exceeded whatever modest hope I originally carried for you. You gave me the foundation everything else was built on," Izuku said. "I don't think I've ever stopped being grateful for that, not for a single day across the entire decade since, and I don't imagine I ever will, however many more decades this particular story still has left to run." "Nor I," Shadow said simply, and the two of them sat together in the familiar evening quiet, the accumulated weight of an entire extraordinary decade settling, at last, into something complete, something whole, and something that both of them understood, without any remaining need for further words, would continue unfolding, generously and deliberately, for as long as either of them remained willing to walk beside it. The river moved on beside them, quiet and constant, exactly as it had on the very first evening this entire extraordinary story began, carrying forward, in its own patient, unhurried way, the same steady current of possibility that had once caught a grieving, quirkless boy and a watchful, patient hedgehog, and had since carried them both, together, considerably further than either could have ever fully imagined possible on that first uncertain evening. Chapter 70. The anomaly first registered on the National Commission's specialized monitoring equipment on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, a brief, powerful energy signature detected in the mountains outside the city, unlike anything the accumulated decades of Quirk-related monitoring had ever previously catalogued, its distinctive resonance pattern setting off alerts across several agencies before fading, within minutes, as abruptly and mysteriously as it had first appeared. Izuku, called in as a consultant given his agency's proximity to the detected location and his own considerable, hard-won expertise with unusual and unprecedented threats, arrived at the site alongside a small team of specialized investigators, and felt, the moment he stepped into the clearing where the anomaly had been centered, a prickling, unmistakable familiarity that settled over him with the weight of long-buried memory finally, unexpectedly resurfacing. "This feels like chaos energy," Izuku told the lead investigator, crouching to examine the scorched, oddly patterned earth at the clearing's center, his trained eye recognizing, in the specific quality of the disturbance, an echo of sensations he had not encountered directly in years, not since the earliest stretches of his training beside a construction site that had long since been redeveloped into ordinary apartments. "I haven't felt anything like this since I was young. Since before UA." The investigator, unfamiliar with the specific terminology, pressed for clarification, and Izuku, choosing his words with the same careful consideration he had always applied to any discussion of Shadow's true nature and origins, offered a measured, partial explanation that conveyed the anomaly's significance without fully revealing the personal history underlying his recognition of it. "I need to consult someone with more direct expertise in this particular phenomenon," Izuku said, already reaching for his phone, the accumulated urgency of the discovery settling into him with a gravity he had not felt in longer than he could easily remember. "I'll have more information within the hour." Shadow arrived at the clearing considerably faster than Izuku's message should have reasonably allowed, materializing at the site's edge with the same abrupt, displacement-marked speed that had first startled a 10-year-old Izuku beside a park bench more than a decade earlier, and the expression on his face as he surveyed the scorched, patterned earth carried a gravity Izuku had rarely seen him display, even across the accumulated weight of everything their long, shared history had asked of both of them. "This should not be possible," Shadow said, his voice carrying an unmistakable, uncharacteristic edge of genuine alarm. "This signature. I recognize it. It should not exist in this dimension at all." "What is it?" Izuku asked, the urgency of Shadow's reaction settling a corresponding weight of concern into his own chest. Shadow was quiet for a long moment, his red eyes fixed on the scorched earth with an intensity that suggested he was working through implications considerably larger than anything the immediate physical evidence alone could convey. "It appears," he said finally, "that something, or someone, from the world I originally came from has found a way to follow me here. I did not believe that was possible. I took considerable care, when I first arrived in this dimension more than a decade ago, to ensure exactly that outcome could not occur." Chapter 71. That evening, gathered at the familiar apartment Izuku shared with Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, Shadow offered, for the first time in the entirety of their more than a decade of shared history, a fuller and more complete account of his origins than he had ever previously been willing to share, the gravity of the day's discovery apparently overriding whatever careful reserve had once kept those details private even from the people who had come to matter most to him in this world. "I came from a world considerably different from this one," Shadow began, settling into the apartment's familiar living room with an uncharacteristic stillness that immediately signaled the seriousness of what was to follow. "A world where power like mine was neither singular nor especially remarkable, where beings capable of feats this world would consider miraculous moved through everyday life with a casualness this dimension's inhabitants would find difficult to fully comprehend. I was created, rather than born, the product of considerable scientific ambition and, in ways I did not fully understand until many years into my own existence, considerable personal tragedy that I do not intend to detail further tonight, beyond acknowledging that it shaped nearly everything about who I became." Izuku, listening with the same careful, complete attention he had always brought to Shadow's rare moments of vulnerability, found himself absorbing this account with a mixture of long-held curiosity finally satisfied and a new, sharper concern for what the day's discovery might ultimately mean for the being who had shaped nearly the entirety of his own extraordinary life. "I arrived in this dimension somewhat by accident," Shadow continued, "following an encounter in my own world that left me questioning, for reasons I will not elaborate on tonight, whether the life I had been living there still held meaning for me. I found, upon arriving here, a world considerably different from my own, one where quirks had reshaped the entire fabric of society in ways my own world's more concentrated, singular forms of power never had. I intended, initially, only to observe, to understand this strange new place before deciding whether to attempt a return. I did not expect to find, sitting alone on a park bench, a grieving, quirkless boy whose situation reminded me, more than I was initially comfortable acknowledging, of struggles I had witnessed and, in some cases, failed to adequately address in my own world. You stayed because of me, Izuku said quietly, the realization settling into him with a weight he had not fully anticipated, despite more than a decade of accumulated evidence pointing toward exactly this conclusion. I stayed, Shadow confirmed, because I recognized in you an opportunity to do something I had not always managed successfully in my own world, to build someone capable of carrying genuine power without being destroyed or corrupted by it. I did not fully understand, when I first made that choice, how completely it would come to define the subsequent decade of my existence, nor how attached I would become to the life we built together, and to the family that has since grown around it. I want you to understand that clearly, tonight, given what tomorrow may potentially demand of both of us. Whatever this anomaly ultimately represents, whatever it means for my own continued presence in this world, the choice I made beside that park bench remains the single decision of my existence I have never once regretted. Momo, listening to this extraordinary account with her characteristic thoughtful attention, offered the question that had been quietly forming in all of their minds throughout Shadow's careful, deliberate explanation. Do you think this anomaly means someone from your world is trying to find you? She asked. Or bring you back? I do not yet know, Shadow admitted. But I intend to find out, before whatever this represents has the opportunity to threaten anyone in this world I have come to consider genuinely, irreplaceably my own. Chapter 72. The investigation that followed over the subsequent days drew together Izuku's professional resources and Shadow's own considerable, if rarely displayed, expertise regarding the theoretical mechanics of dimensional travel, the two of them working alongside a small, carefully vetted team of the Commission's most trusted scientific specialists to trace the anomaly's origin and probable significance. The breakthrough arrived nearly a week into the investigation, a secondary, weaker energy signature detected at a remote location several hundred kilometers from the original anomaly, its pattern carrying enough similarity to the first that the investigating team quickly concluded the two events were connected, likely markers of the same phenomenon's continued, gradual manifestation within this dimension. I need to go there directly, Shadow told Izuku, once the secondary signature's location had been confirmed. Whatever is attempting to establish a connection to this dimension, I stand a considerably better chance of understanding and, if necessary, addressing it directly than any instrument or specialist analysis could hope to achieve remotely. I'm coming with you, Izuku said, the statement carrying none of the tentative uncertainty a request might have implied, only the settled, unshakable determination of someone who had spent more than a decade building a partnership he had no intention of abandoning now, precisely when the stakes had grown personal in a way few of their prior confrontations ever had. Shadow considered this for a long moment, his usual instinct toward careful, protective reserve visibly warring with the accumulated weight of everything their shared history had taught him about Izuku's genuine capability and equally genuine right to stand beside him through whatever challenge emerged. This may not be a threat conventional training has prepared either of us to fully understand, Shadow said finally. But I confess, if I am to face whatever this ultimately represents, I would rather face it with you beside me than encounter it alone. Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, informed of the plan during a tense, carefully coordinated briefing the following morning, each offered their own immediate, unhesitating commitment to accompany the expedition, their combined partnership, tested across more than a decade of genuine, hard-won trust, extending naturally now to a crisis that touched the very origins of the being who had first brought all of them together. Whatever this is, Ochako said, gripping Izuku's hand with the same fierce, unwavering warmth that had defined her presence in his life since the very beginning of their shared journey, we're facing it together. All of it. Shadow's been there for every single crisis this family has ever weathered. We're not about to let him face this one alone, whatever it actually turns out to be. The expedition departed the following morning, the small, determined group making their way toward the remote location where the secondary signature had been detected, each of them carrying, alongside their considerable accumulated training and hard-won partnership, the unspoken but powerful understanding that whatever awaited them at their destination represented a genuinely unprecedented threat, one that traced back not to any villain or crisis this world had ever produced, but to the mysterious, largely unexplored origins of the patient, exacting hedgehog who had first decided, more than a decade earlier, that a grieving, quirkless boy on a park bench was worth the effort of becoming something more. Chapter 73. The remote location, a secluded valley several hours beyond the city's furthest outlying districts, greeted the expedition with an unnatural, unsettling quiet, the surrounding wildlife conspicuously absent, the air itself carrying a faint, static charge that Izuku recognized, with the same prickling familiarity that had first struck him at the original anomaly's site, as an unmistakable signature of the same chaos energy Shadow's rare conditioning exercises had once exposed him to during the earliest years of his training. Shadow moved through the valley with a careful, deliberate wariness that Izuku had rarely witnessed from him, his usual flat confidence replaced by something more cautious, more genuinely uncertain, and Izuku, watching his mentor's unfamiliar hesitation, felt his own concern sharpen correspondingly. The accumulated weight of more than a decade of trusting Shadow's judgment now colliding with the unsettling recognition that Shadow himself did not fully understand what they were walking toward. The valley's center held a structure that had clearly not existed prior to the anomaly's initial manifestation, a strange, angular formation of dark, faintly glowing material that resembled nothing in Izuku's considerable accumulated experience with either conventional architecture or Quirk-generated construction, and Shadow, approaching the structure with visible tension, offered a grim, quiet confirmation of Izuku's own growing suspicion. This is a stabilized dimensional anchor, Shadow said. Someone has constructed a deliberate point of connection between this world and my own. This is not an accident, or a natural phenomenon. This required considerable, sophisticated intention. Who could have built this? Momo asked, her analytical mind already working through the structure's implications with the same rigorous attention she brought to every significant challenge. Shadow considered the question with careful, evident reluctance before answering. There are few beings in my original world capable of this particular kind of technical achievement, he said. Fewer still who would have both the motivation and the resources to pursue it specifically in relation to my own disappearance. I can think of only one individual whose combination of scientific capability and personal investment in my whereabouts would produce exactly this outcome. The structure's activation, triggered by a proximity sensor none of the gathered group had detected until it was already too late to prevent, arrived with a sudden, disorienting surge of energy that sent the entire clearing into a brief, blinding cascade of light, and when the disturbance finally settled, the group found themselves facing a figure who had emerged from the structure's center, a being whose appearance, pale and androgynous with the same fundamental otherworldliness that had always marked Shadow as something beyond this dimension's natural order, immediately confirmed Shadow's grim suspicion. Rouge, Shadow said, his voice carrying an unmistakable mixture of shock and complicated, long-buried emotion. It has been a very long time. Chapter 74. The figure who had emerged from the dimensional structure regarded Shadow with an expression that mixed genuine relief and considerable, evident frustration, her posture carrying the particular tension of someone who had spent a very long time searching for something she had genuinely feared might never be found. You disappeared without a single word, the figure said, her voice carrying an accusatory edge tempered by unmistakable, underlying warmth. Do you have any idea what that did to the people who cared whether you lived or died? I have spent years, Shadow, tracking fragments of dimensional disturbance across dozens of failed attempts, trying to find whatever thread might eventually lead back to you. I did not believe anyone was looking, Shadow said, his usual flat composure carrying an unfamiliar strain that Izuku recognized, watching him, as genuine and considerable emotional weight. I left because I believed my continued presence in that world was doing more harm than good. I did not think my absence would be genuinely missed, beyond the immediate operational inconvenience it likely caused. The figure's expression shifted, something softer and more clearly hurt surfacing beneath her initial frustration. You were never merely an operational asset, she said. Whatever else happened between us, whatever mistakes either of us made along the way, you mattered. You still matter. I did not spend years building an unstable, dangerous dimensional bridge because I needed you back for some tactical purpose. I built it because I needed to know whether you were even still alive. Izuku, watching this exchange unfold with a growing, complicated understanding of just how much of Shadow's history remained genuinely unknown to him even after more than a decade of close partnership, found himself stepping forward, drawn by an instinct to support his mentor through a confrontation that clearly carried weight far beyond anything their shared training had ever directly addressed. I'm Izuku, he said, offering the introduction with the same careful diplomacy he had learned to apply to genuinely uncertain, high-stakes situations. Shadow trained me. He's been an essential part of my life for more than a decade now. Whatever brought you here, I'd like to understand it, if you're willing to explain. The figure, studying Izuku with an evaluating attention that carried unmistakable echoes of Shadow's own characteristic assessment, offered a small, considering nod. Rouge, she introduced herself. I worked alongside Shadow, in the world he came from, during a period considerably more complicated than I have time to fully explain here. I am not here to force him back to a world he clearly chose to leave. I am here because disappearing without any explanation, after everything we had been through together, was cruel, whatever his reasoning, and because I needed, for my own sake as much as anyone else's, to finally understand why. Shadow, absorbing this with visible, considerable difficulty, offered his own careful, deliberate response. I left because I had grown tired of a life defined entirely by conflict and obligation, he said. I did not believe, at the time, that explaining this to anyone still embedded in that world would produce anything beyond further obligation, further attempts to convince me to return to a role I no longer believed I could sustain without losing something essential about myself. I see now that the silence itself caused harm I did not adequately anticipate. I am sorry for that, Rouge. Genuinely. You deserved better than simply vanishing without any explanation at all. Chapter 75. The conversation that followed, extending across the better part of the afternoon as the gathered group settled into the valley's unsettling but no longer immediately threatening clearing, revealed a fuller picture of Shadow's original departure and the considerable, genuine concern it had left behind among the small circle of beings who had once called him a trusted, essential partner. Rouge explained, in careful, measured detail, the years of searching that had followed Shadow's sudden disappearance, the painstaking, largely unsuccessful attempts to trace any sign of his continued existence, and the eventual, desperate decision to pursue the considerable risk of constructing a stabilized dimensional anchor once fragmentary evidence had finally suggested Shadow had crossed into an entirely different reality altogether. I am not asking you to return, Rouge told Shadow, as the afternoon's conversation gradually settled into something less charged, more genuinely reconciliatory. I can see, watching you here, surrounded by people who clearly love and depend on you, that you have built something considerably more stable and complete than anything our original world ever offered you. I only needed to see it for myself. To know that your disappearance meant you had found something worth disappearing for, rather than some darker fate I had spent years quietly, privately fearing. Shadow, listening to this with an expression that carried, beneath its careful composure, genuine and considerable relief, offered his own measured response. I have built something here I did not believe myself capable of building, in our original world, he admitted. A family, freely chosen rather than assigned by circumstance or obligation. I do not regret the choice that brought me here, even now, understanding more clearly the cost that choice imposed on people I once considered genuinely important to me. Izuku, watching this extraordinary reconciliation unfold, felt a complicated swell of emotion settle into him, gratitude for the resolution taking shape alongside a newer, sharper appreciation for exactly how much Shadow had genuinely sacrificed, all those years ago, in choosing to remain in this world rather than return to whatever life and connections he had left behind in his own. You gave up an entire world, an entire life, to stay here and train me, Izuku said quietly, once Rouge had stepped away to begin the careful work of safely deactivating the unstable dimensional structure. I don't think I ever fully understood the weight of that, until today. Shadow considered this with the same careful attention he brought to every significant reflection. I did not view it as a sacrifice, at the time, he said. I viewed it as an opportunity, one I was not certain I deserved given everything that had come before it in my original world. I understand now, watching Rouge's genuine relief at finding me alive and well, that the choice carried costs I did not fully weigh in the moment I made it. But I do not regret it, Izuku. Not then, and considerably less now, having lived through everything the choice has since produced. The dimensional anchor's careful, methodical deactivation, completed under Rouge's expert supervision over the following hours, sealed the temporary connection between the two worlds with a finality that carried its own significant, bittersweet weight. Rouge's eventual departure back through the closing threshold accompanied by a final, warm exchange between old, complicated friends who had, against considerable odds, finally found their way back to genuine, if distant, understanding. Find a way to send word occasionally, Rouge told Shadow, as the dimensional threshold began its final, irreversible collapse. Not because I expect you to return. Just so I know, without needing to build another unstable, dangerous anchor to find out, that you're still exactly where you chose to be. I will find a way, Shadow promised, and Izuku, standing beside his mentor as the threshold finally, completely closed, understood that he had just witnessed something genuinely rare, the closing of one significant chapter of Shadow's extraordinary, largely unexplored history, and the quiet, hard-won piece of a decision, made more than a decade earlier, finally and completely validated by the being who had made it. Chapter 76. The journey home from the remote valley carried a reflective, quieter quality than the tense uncertainty that had marked their arrival, the entire group processing, each in their own way, the extraordinary revelations the day had produced. Izuku found himself walking beside Shadow for much of the return journey, the two of them settling into a comfortable, companionable silence that eventually gave way to a deeper, more searching conversation than either of them had shared in some time. I keep thinking about what Rouge said, Izuku admitted, as the familiar outline of the city began to reappear on the horizon. About how much your disappearance cost the people who cared about you, back in your own world. I think I always understood, abstractly, that you'd given something up to stay here. I don't think I fully understood the shape of it until today. Shadow considered this with his characteristic careful attention before responding. I did not fully understand it myself, until today, he admitted. I had convinced myself, across the years, that my departure had been a relatively clean severance, that whatever connections I left behind would adjust and move forward without excessive difficulty. Seeing Rouge's genuine, considerable relief today, understanding the years of searching that preceded it, forced a reckoning with that convenient assumption that I confess I had been avoiding for longer than I care to admit. Does it change anything? Izuku asked. Knowing what it actually cost. It clarifies something, Shadow said, rather than changes it. I do not regret choosing this world, choosing you, choosing the family we have built together across these years. But I understand now, more completely than before, that the choice was not without genuine cost to people who deserved better than my silence. I intend to honor Rouge's request, to find a way to maintain some connection, however distant, so that cost does not compound further simply through continued neglect. The group's return to the city brought with it a period of quieter, more domestic adjustment, the extraordinary events of the preceding days settling gradually into the accumulated texture of their shared, remarkable life, though Izuku found himself, in the weeks that followed, returning more than once to the weight of everything the encounter with Rouge had revealed about the being who had shaped nearly the entirety of his own extraordinary transformation. Momo, ever thoughtful, raised her own careful observation during one of the group's evening gatherings in the days following their return. I think it's worth acknowledging, she said, that we've spent more than a decade with Shadow without ever really asking about the life he left behind to be here. I don't say that as criticism of any of us. I think we were simply so grateful for what he gave us that we didn't think to ask what it had cost him personally. That's fair, Izuku admitted. I think I was so focused on what Shadow was building in me that I didn't spend enough time wondering what he might have been giving up to do it. Shadow, present for this conversation and listening with his usual careful attention, offered his own measured response. I did not particularly want the question asked, in the earlier years, he admitted. I had made my choice, and I did not see value in dwelling on what that choice had cost, particularly while the boy I had chosen to train still needed my full and undivided attention. I am, perhaps, more willing now to acknowledge that cost, having seen it reflected back to me so directly through Rouge's genuine grief and relief. I do not think that acknowledgement diminishes anything about the choice itself. I think it simply makes the choice more honest. Chapter 77. In the months that followed, Shadow made good on his promise to Rouge, working alongside a small, carefully vetted team of the Commission's most trusted dimensional physics specialists to develop a considerably more stable and controlled method of periodic communication between the two worlds, a careful, deliberate process that avoided the kind of dangerous, unstable dimensional breach that had first brought Rouge's search to its dramatic conclusion. The first successful exchange, conducted months later through a carefully engineered, temporary and stable connection point, carried its own significant, treasured weight for Shadow, who approached the communication with a visible nervousness that Izuku found himself recognizing, with a small, private smile, as an unmistakable echo of his own long-ago anxiety before significant, emotionally weighted conversations. She sounds well, Shadow reported afterward, some of his usual careful composure returning as the successful exchange's relief settled into him. Considerably relieved, understandably, that this method proved safer than her own more desperate earlier attempt. She has agreed to periodic exchanges going forward, nothing frequent enough to risk the kind of dangerous instability her original search produced, but enough to maintain some genuine, ongoing connection. I'm glad, Izuku said, and meant it completely, recognizing in Shadow's visible relief the resolution of a weight that had been quietly building since their return from the valley months earlier. You deserve to have that connection, alongside everything you've built here. I don't think either has to come at the expense of the other. The renewed, carefully managed connection to Shadow's original world brought with it its own subtle but meaningful shifts in the accumulated texture of the family's shared life, Shadow occasionally sharing small, carefully filtered details of news from his original world during their continued evening gatherings, the group gradually building, over the following months, a fuller and richer understanding of the extraordinary, largely unexplored history that had shaped the being who had first decided, more than a decade earlier, that a grieving, quirkless boy was worth the effort of becoming something more. Hannah, now well into her own developing career following her successful graduation from UA, found herself drawn into occasional conversations about this extraordinary revelation during her continued, close relationship with the family that had shaped so much of her own extraordinary journey, and Izuku, watching her absorb the full scope of Shadow's origins with the same careful, serious attention she brought to everything significant in her life, felt a particular satisfaction at watching the family's accumulated history continue extending outward, generously and completely, to include even its newest, most recently arrived members. It makes what he gave you even more remarkable, somehow, Hana observed, during one such conversation. Knowing he gave up an entire world, not just some abstract sacrifice, but an entire life and history and set of relationships, to stay here and build what he built with you. I don't think I fully appreciated the scale of that before. Neither did I, Izuku admitted. Not fully. I think some gifts are too large to properly measure until you understand everything they actually cost the person giving them. Chapter 78. The following spring brought its own significant milestone, the 15th anniversary of Shadow's original arrival in this world and his first, fateful decision to approach a grieving, quirkless boy on a park bench, an occasion the family marked with a gathering considerably larger and more significant than their usual, treasured evening visits to the familiar riverside spot. Izuku's mother, All Might, Momo, Tsuyu, Ochako, Hana, and, through the carefully maintained dimensional connection Shadow had spent the preceding months developing, even a brief, warm greeting from Rouge herself, gathered to mark the occasion, the accumulated warmth of an entire, extraordinary family built across 15 years of deliberate, honest choice settling into the familiar riverside park with a completeness that Izuku, looking around at everyone gathered, found himself struggling to fully absorb. 15 years, Shadow observed, settling onto the familiar low stone wall with the same careful, watchful stillness that had first caught a grieving boy's attention a decade and a half earlier. I did not anticipate, when I first arrived in this world, uncertain and untethered from everything I had previously known, that I would still be here, this many years later, surrounded by this much genuine, accumulated warmth. I confess I remain, even now, occasionally surprised by how completely this particular choice reshaped the entire remainder of my existence. I think that's the nature of the best choices, Izuku said, settling beside him with the same easy, comfortable familiarity that had defined their relationship across the accumulated weight of 15 extraordinary years. They rarely announce their full significance in the moment you make them. You just have to trust that continuing, one deliberate step at a time, will eventually reveal whether the choice was worth making. All Might, present for the gathering despite his continued, careful management of his fragile post-retirement health, offered his own warm, considered addition to the reflective conversation. I have watched this particular story unfold for more than a decade now, he said, his tired eyes carrying the particular warmth of someone who had witnessed, and contributed meaningfully to, so much of what the gathered family represented. I do not believe I have ever witnessed a more complete demonstration of what genuine, patient investment in another person's growth can ultimately produce. Not merely a hero. A family. A legacy extending outward into lives none of us could have fully anticipated when this all began. The gathering stretched long into the warm spring evening, the accumulated weight of 15 years of deliberate, honest choice settling into something that carried, for everyone present, the particular completeness of a story that had never actually needed a single, final ending, only the continued, patient work of choosing, again and again, to keep building something worth having. Izuku, looking around at the gathered family, the hedgehog who had first seen worth in him before he saw it in himself, the mother whose love had never once wavered, the mentor whose sacrifice had entrusted him with power beyond measure, the three remarkable people who had chosen to build a life alongside him, and the newest generation now carrying that same deliberate, generous legacy forward into their own unwritten futures, felt the full and complete weight of everything 15 years had built settle into something he understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, would continue extending outward, generously and deliberately, for as long as anyone remained willing to choose it. Chapter 79. In the years that followed the 15th anniversary gathering, Izuku's mentorship program continued its steady, meaningful growth, expanding well beyond its original modest scope into a fully integrated component of UA's broader curriculum, drawing students not merely from within the country's borders but, increasingly, from international programs eager to replicate the program's demonstrated success in cultivating genuine capability among students the conventional Quirk-focused curriculum had historically struggled to serve. Izuku found himself, in this period, traveling with growing frequency to consult on similar programs developing at hero training institutions across the world, his own extraordinary journey from quirkless boy to internationally respected hero and mentor having become, in the years since his initial rise to prominence, Something approaching a foundational case study for an entirely new approach to hero training that emphasized discipline and foundational capability alongside, rather than subordinate to, the more traditional quirk-focused curriculum that had defined the profession for generations. I never expected this part of it, Izuku admitted to Momo, during one of their now less frequent but still treasured evening conversations, the demands of his expanding international consulting work having introduced its own new rhythm into the family's accumulated, well-established life together. Training Hana felt personal, immediate. This feels like something considerably larger, more abstract. I'm still adjusting to what it means to be shaping an entire approach to hero training, rather than just one student's individual journey. Momo, her own considerable career having grown alongside Izuku's into its own significant, respected standing within the broader hero community, offered her characteristically thoughtful perspective. I think the abstraction is just distance, she said. Underneath it, it's still the same fundamental work. One student at a time, wherever in the world that student happens to be, receiving the same basic gift Shadow once gave you. The scale has changed. The essential nature of the work hasn't. Hana, now several years into her own promising professional career, found her own path increasingly intersecting with this expanding international dimension of Izuku's continued work, her own developing expertise in foundational training methodology drawing invitations to assist with several of the emerging international programs, and Izuku found himself watching her step confidently into exactly the kind of mentorship role he had once modeled for her, experiencing a particular, powerful satisfaction that felt, in its own way, like watching a promise made more than a decade earlier continue fulfilling itself in ways he had not initially anticipated. You're doing exactly what I hoped you might, someday, Izuku told her, during one such joint consulting trip, the two of them reviewing a foreign program's developing curriculum together with the same collaborative rigor that had once defined their own original mentor and student relationship. Passing it forward. Building your own version of what Shadow gave both of us. I had good teachers, Hana said, simply, and the warmth of the acknowledgement settled comfortably between them, the accumulated weight of an entire extraordinary legacy continuing to extend itself outward, generously and completely, into a future neither of them could yet fully see the shape of. Chapter 80. A significant test of the expanding international program arrived during a joint training exercise held at a newly established academy in a country whose own hero infrastructure remained considerably less developed than the systems Izuku and his colleagues had spent years refining domestically. The exercise designed to evaluate whether the foundational discipline methodology Izuku's original program had pioneered could translate effectively across considerably different cultural and institutional contexts. The exercise itself proceeded largely according to plan through its opening stages, the visiting students demonstrating a promising, if understandably less refined, grasp of the foundational principles Izuku and Hana had spent the preceding weeks working to instill, but the day's proceedings were disrupted, partway through the exercise's more advanced stages, by a genuine, unplanned emergency, a structural failure in the training facility's aging infrastructure that threatened to collapse a section of the building where several younger, less experienced students remained gathered. Izuku moved immediately to coordinate the evacuation, his years of accumulated crisis response experience settling into familiar, practiced focus even amid the genuine chaos of the unfolding emergency, and found, working alongside him with the same disciplined, coordinated efficiency, Hana's own considerable, hard-won capability rising to meet the crisis with a confidence that would have seemed, to the frightened, uncertain girl who had first arrived at Izuku's original program more than a decade earlier, entirely unimaginable. Together, they cleared the threatened section of the building with methodical, practiced efficiency, Izuku's raw capability combining with Hana's own considerable, developed skill to ensure every student reached safety well before the structure's eventual, contained collapse, and the visiting academy's staff, watching the crisis resolve with remarkably minimal injury given the genuine severity of the structural failure, offered their own considerable, grateful acknowledgement of exactly the kind of practical, real-world validation the foundational training methodology had just decisively demonstrated. This is exactly why the discipline matters, Izuku told the assembled visiting staff, once the immediate crisis had fully resolved and the building's remaining occupants had been safely accounted for. Not because it looks impressive in a controlled training exercise. Because it holds up, completely, when something genuinely unexpected happens and there's no time to improvise from scratch. That's the entire foundation this whole approach was built on, more than 15 years ago, by someone who understood that principle before I ever did myself. Hannah, standing beside him in the settling aftermath of the crisis, offered her own quiet, satisfied addition. I think Shadow would be proud, watching this, she said. Not just of you. Of what you built out of what he gave you. And now what I'm building out of what you gave me. It just keeps going, doesn't it? Further than any of us probably ever expected it to reach. It does, Izuku agreed, and found, standing amid the settling chaos of a crisis successfully weathered through the accumulated strength of a legacy now extending itself across international borders, an overwhelming, quiet gratitude for exactly how far a single choice, made beside a park bench more than 15 years earlier, had ultimately managed to travel. Chapter 81. The years that followed carried Izuku's continued professional and personal life through its own rich, accumulating texture, the international dimension of his mentorship work settling into a sustainable, meaningful rhythm alongside his continued domestic hero career and the steady, treasured constancy of his relationship with Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, a partnership that had, by this point, weathered considerably more than a decade and a half of genuine, deliberate commitment. Shadow's own continued presence throughout this period carried its own evolving, settled rhythm, the periodic, carefully managed communication with Rouge and his original world having resolved, over the years, into something considerably more comfortable and less fraught than its initial, emotionally charged re-establishment, Shadow occasionally sharing updates from that distant, largely unseen world during the family's continued gatherings, the accumulated history of his origins gradually becoming simply another integrated piece of the rich, complete life they had all built together. I find myself, at this stage of my existence, more at peace than I believed myself capable of, Shadow observed, during one of the family's now regular anniversary gatherings by the familiar Riverside Park, the accumulated years having transformed what had once been a single, significant milestone into a comfortable, treasured annual tradition. I did not anticipate, when I first arrived in this world, that piece of this particular, complete quality was something available to a being with my particular history and origins. I am grateful, more than I generally find adequate words to express, that I was wrong about that particular assumption. Izuku, listening to this rare, unguarded admission with the same careful attention he had always brought to Shadow's most vulnerable moments, felt the accumulated weight of an entire extraordinary relationship, now spanning more than 15 years, settle into something he recognized as genuinely, completely whole. You gave me everything, Izuku said, the sentiment carrying the full, accumulated weight of every prior occasion he had offered some version of the same essential gratitude across their long, treasured history together. I think I've said that to you more times than I can count, across all these years. I don't think I'll ever stop needing to say it, honestly, however many more years this particular story still has left to run. Shadow's answering expression carried the particular, quiet warmth that had, over the years, become his most common and most treasured response to exactly this kind of accumulated, repeated gratitude. Then say it as many times as you need to, Shadow said. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I never tire of hearing it, however many times it comes. The gathering continued long into the warm evening, the accumulated family, old bonds, and new ones alike, settling into the familiar, treasured rhythm that had, across more than a decade and a half, become the truest and most complete measure of everything a single, deliberate choice beside a lonely park bench had ultimately managed to build, extending outward, generously and completely, into a future that showed no sign, even now, of reaching its natural or necessary conclusion. Chapter 82. A new challenge arrived, some months later, in the form of an invitation Izuku had not fully anticipated receiving, a request from the National Commission to help establish formal, standardized guidelines for the growing number of foundational discipline programs now operating across the country and, increasingly, internationally. An effort intended to ensure the methodology's continued integrity and effectiveness as its reach and influence continued to expand well beyond what its original modest pilot cohort could ever have anticipated. I keep thinking about how strange this whole situation truly is, Izuku admitted to Shadow, the two of them reviewing an early draft of the proposed guidelines during one of their continued, treasured evening sessions, now considerably less frequent than the intensive training years of Izuku's own youth but no less valued for their relative rarity. Standardizing this. Turning what started as one desperate, improvised bargain beside a park bench into something with official documentation and formal certification processes. I don't know whether to feel proud or slightly mournful about how institutional it's become. Shadow considered this with his characteristic thoughtful attention before responding. I understand the sentiment, he said. There is something to be said for the raw, improvised quality of what we built together, all those years ago, something that formal institutionalization inevitably smooths and standardizes in ways that lose a measure of its original, personal character. But I would ask you to consider the alternative. Without formal structure, this remains available only to students fortunate enough to encounter a mentor willing and able to build something similarly bespoke, the same singular good fortune that once found you. Formalizing it, difficult as that process may feel, ensures considerably more students have access to at least the foundational shape of what we built, even without the specific, personal relationship that made our own particular version of it so significant. I think you're right, Izuku said, though there is something bittersweet about it. I keep thinking about Hana, about how much her journey mattered specifically because of the personal relationship, not just the technical methodology. I worry that gets lost, in the process of standardizing it for wider use. It need not be lost entirely, Shadow said. The formal structure can provide the foundation. The personal relationship, the individual mentorship, remains something each program's specific instructors will need to cultivate on their own terms, the same way you cultivated it with Hana, the same way I cultivated it with you. Standardization of the technical methodology does not preclude the human element that made our own version of this genuinely transformative. It simply ensures more students have access to the opportunity for that human element to eventually develop, wherever they happen to find themselves. Izuku carried that reassurance with him through the following months of careful, deliberate work developing the formal guidelines, drawing on his own accumulated experience, on Hana's growing expertise, and on the broader input of the international network of instructors that had developed around the methodology's expanding reach, and found himself, watching the guidelines take their final, considered shape, genuinely satisfied that the effort had managed to preserve, alongside its necessary technical standardization, the essential, human core of everything Shadow had originally built into him. Chapter 83. The formal guidelines completion and adoption, announced at a considerable ceremony drawing representatives from hero training institutions across the country and several international partners, marked a genuine, significant milestone in the methodology's continued evolution, and Izuku found himself, delivering the ceremony's keynote address, reflecting on the full, extraordinary arc of everything a single, desperate bargain beside a park bench had ultimately grown into. 17 long years ago, Izuku told the gathered assembly, his voice carrying the calm, settled confidence of someone who had, across nearly 2 full decades of accumulated experience, long since made peace with the particular weight of public significance his extraordinary journey had earned him. I was a frightened, quirkless boy who believed, with the full and complete certainty children often carry about their own limitations, that my life had already been decided by a diagnosis I had no power to change. A complete stranger looked closely at that frightened boy and decided, without any obligation or any guarantee whatsoever of eventual success, that he was worth the effort of becoming something more. That decision, and the 7 long years of patient, exacting discipline that followed it, built the entire foundation everything else in my life has since been constructed upon. He paused, looking out over the gathered assembly, recognizing among them Hana, now a respected instructor in her own right, several of the program's other graduated students who had gone on to build their own significant, meaningful careers, and representatives from the international programs that had adopted and adapted the methodology for their own considerably different contexts and needs. What we are formalizing today, Izuku continued, is not merely a training methodology. It is a promise, the same promise a patient, exacting mentor once made to a grieving, quirkless boy, that worth is not something a person waits to be given by circumstance or by a quirk they did or did not happen to be born with. Worth is something built, deliberately, through discipline and repetition and the willingness to keep going even when the outcome remains genuinely uncertain. I intend for these guidelines to ensure that promise remains available to as many students as possible, for as long as this profession continues to exist, regardless of whether they happen to encounter their own particular version of the stranger who once decided a lonely, quirkless boy on a park bench was, against all outward evidence, worth the effort of becoming something more. The ceremony's conclusion brought Izuku, Hana, and several of the assembled instructors together for a final, warm celebration, and Shadow, present at the ceremony's edges in his characteristic careful, unobtrusive manner, found Izuku amid the gathering's dispersing crowd with the same quiet, genuine pride that had come to define so much of his response to Izuku's continued, extraordinary growth across the accumulated years of their shared history. You have built something considerably larger than either of us could have imagined, all those years ago, Shadow observed, his voice carrying the particular warmth that Izuku had learned, across nearly 2 decades, to treasure above almost any other measure of approval available to him. I offered a single boy discipline. You have built an entire, enduring tradition capable of extending that same gift forward, indefinitely, into a future neither of us will ever fully see the complete shape of. I couldn't have built any of it without you, Izuku said, the gratitude carrying the same full, accumulated weight it had carried across every prior occasion he had offered some version of this essential truth. You gave me the foundation. Everything else was simply just building outward, year after year, from what you first started. Then let us continue building, Shadow said simply, and the two of them, standing together amid the settling warmth of the ceremony's conclusion, understood, without any remaining need for further words, that whatever the coming years still intended to demand of either of them, they would meet it exactly as they had met everything before it, together, disciplined, and endlessly grateful, for as long as the story continued to unfold. Chapter 84. On a quiet evening some months after the formal ceremony, the entire extended family gathered once more at the familiar riverside park, the tradition now well established across nearly 2 decades of accumulated history, and Izuku found himself, settling onto the familiar bench beside Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, with Hana and Shadow close by and his mother and All Might completing the gathered circle, struck once again by the sheer, accumulated distance the entire extraordinary journey had traveled since a single, desperate evening nearly 17 years earlier. I received word from Rouge this week, Shadow mentioned, during a lull in the evening's easy, familiar conversation. She tells me the guidelines you developed have drawn considerable interest even in my own original world, among the few institutions there that maintain any awareness of dimensional developments. It seems this particular legacy may extend even further than either of us initially anticipated. That's remarkable, Momo said, genuine wonder coloring her voice at the implication. A methodology built from one boy's training on this side of a dimensional divide, potentially influencing how an entirely different world approaches the cultivation of capability and discipline. I don't think either of us fully grasped, 17 years ago, how far the ripples from that first conversation might eventually travel. Izuku, absorbing this latest, extraordinary development with the same settled, grateful wonder that had come to define so much of his response to the accumulated scope of everything his life had ultimately built, found himself reflecting, once again, on the particular, powerful truth Shadow had first offered him beside this exact spot, so many years earlier. That power was never something a person simply waited to receive, but something built, deliberately, one disciplined choice at a time. Until the accumulated weight of those choices produced something genuinely extraordinary. I think about that first evening constantly, still, Izuku admitted, looking out over the familiar, quietly moving river. A boy with a notebook, and a stranger willing to ask a single question that changed everything. I don't think I've ever stopped being grateful for it, not for a single day across all these years. Nor have I, Shadow said, and the simple, complete honesty of the admission settled over the gathered family with the particular warmth of a truth that needed no further elaboration. Hana, listening to this exchange with the same thoughtful attention she had always brought to the family's most significant conversations, offered her own quiet, considered addition. I think that's the actual secret underneath everything this whole story has built, she said. Not the power, or the training, or even the discipline itself. It's the willingness to keep choosing gratitude, keep choosing connection, even after everything has already been built and proven and secured. Most stories stop once the hard part is over. This one just keeps finding new reasons to keep going. Izuku, sitting among the accumulated family that had shaped nearly the entirety of his extraordinary life, felt the truth of her observation settle into him with the particular, complete satisfaction of a lesson finally, fully understood after nearly 2 decades of lived experience. The evening deepened around them, the river moving quietly beside the gathered family exactly as it had on the very first evening this entire extraordinary story began, and Izuku understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, that whatever the coming years still intended to bring, whatever new chapters still waited to unfold in a story that had already traveled so much further than anyone could have reasonably anticipated, he would meet all of it exactly as he had met everything before. Surrounded by the people who had chosen, freely and completely and repeatedly, to walk this extraordinary road beside him, for as long as any of them remained willing to keep choosing it. Chapter 85. In the weeks following that particular gathering, Izuku found himself reflecting more than usual on the accumulated shape of the life he had built, prompted in part by a request from a journalist working on a retrospective piece marking nearly 2 decades since his own dramatic entrance into the world of professional heroism. A request that asked him to look back across the entirety of his extraordinary journey with a deliberateness he did not often allow himself amid the accumulated busyness of his continued, active career. The interview, conducted over several unhurried sessions at the familiar apartment he still shared with Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, carried Izuku through a careful, considered accounting of everything the preceding 17 years had built: the frightened, quirkless boy on the park bench, the 5 years of secret, punishing discipline, the alley confrontation that first brought him into contact with All Might, the years at UA and the deepening bonds that had grown into the family surrounding him now, the inheritance of One for All and everything that inheritance had ultimately demanded and given in return, the mentorship program and its steadily expanding international reach, and, more recently, the extraordinary revelation of Shadow's own origins and the careful, patient work of honoring the connections that revelation had brought back into focus. Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako each sat in on portions of the sessions as well, offering their own perspectives on the years they had shared alongside him, their combined recollections filling in details and textures that Izuku's own account, focused as it naturally was on his own experience, might otherwise have left comparatively thin and incomplete. The journalist, midway through their final session, paused to ask a question Izuku had fielded many times across the preceding years but found, on this particular occasion, striking him with unexpected weight. "Do you ever wonder, even now, what your life would have looked like without that first evening on the park bench?" she asked. Without Shadow, without the training, without any of it. Izuku considered the question carefully, recognizing in it a genuine curiosity rather than mere journalistic formality. "I try not to spend too much time in that particular hypothetical," he admitted. "Not because it's too painful to consider, though I suppose there's some of that too. Mostly because I don't think the exercise is especially useful. The boy who might have existed without that evening isn't someone I have any real access to anymore. He's a shadow of a possibility, not a person I can meaningfully compare myself against. What I can say is that I remember, vividly, what the days immediately before that evening felt like. The isolation. The quiet, grinding certainty that nothing was ever going to change. I don't need the hypothetical to understand how much that first conversation altered everything that followed. The contrast between the boy I was in that specific moment and the man sitting across from you now tells me everything I need to know about what the choice actually meant." "What would you tell that boy on the park bench?" the journalist asked, near the conclusion of their final session together, "if you could somehow speak to him now, knowing everything that was still ahead of him?" Izuku considered the question with the same careful seriousness he brought to every significant reflection, and found, searching for the answer, that it arrived with a clarity that surprised even him. "I would tell him that the fear he was carrying, the belief that his life had already been decided by something outside his control, was real and understandable, but it was never actually true," Izuku said. "I would tell him that the stranger about to sit down beside him saw something worth building, long before there was any proof that the building would succeed, and that trusting that stranger, difficult and frightening as it would sometimes be, was going to be the best decision of his entire life. I would tell him that the discipline was going to hurt, more than he could currently imagine, but that the hurt was never the point. The point was always what the discipline was quietly building underneath it, one repetition at a time, until eventually it became a foundation solid enough to hold an entire, extraordinary life. The retrospective piece, published some weeks later, drew considerable attention across the broader hero community and beyond, its account of Izuku's extraordinary journey resonating, in the weeks and months that followed its publication, with a considerable audience of readers who recognized in it something larger than simply one hero's individual story, a broader, more universal testament to the particular, transformative power of patient belief, freely offered to someone who had not yet earned any proof that such belief was warranted. The piece's editors later reported that it had become one of the publication's most widely shared features in several years, a fact that surprised Izuku considerably less once he began reading through the flood of reader responses that followed, each one carrying its own small, distinct echo of the same hope a single conversation had once given him. Izuku received, in the months following the piece's publication, a considerable volume of correspondence from readers across the country and, increasingly, from readers in other nations where the mentorship methodology's growing international reach had already begun cultivating its own local audiences, many of them sharing their own stories of struggle and eventual, hard-won transformation, several explicitly crediting the methodology's foundational principles, filtered through their own local instructors and mentors, with providing exactly the kind of disciplined foundation that had once carried a frightened, quirkless boy toward an entirely different and considerably more extraordinary future than he had ever believed himself capable of reaching, a future he still, even now, found himself quietly marveling at on his more reflective evenings. Shadow, reviewing a small selection of this correspondence during one of their continued evening conversations, offered his own quiet, considered reflection on the accumulated scope of what a single conversation beside a park bench had ultimately managed to produce. "I did not train you to become a symbol," Shadow observed. "I trained you to become capable, disciplined, and whole. That you have also, in the process, become a source of hope and possibility for people neither of us will ever meet, people scattered across a world considerably larger than the small stretch of Riverside Park where all of this originally began, is not something I anticipated when I first made my choice. I find, reading through even this small sample of what your journey has apparently meant to others, that I could not be more satisfied with how completely that original, uncertain choice has ultimately been vindicated. I confess there is a particular satisfaction, difficult for me to fully articulate even now, in recognizing that the discipline I once offered a single frightened boy has traveled so much further than either of us could have reasonably anticipated, reaching people whose names I will never learn and whose faces I will never see, simply because one boy chose, again and again, to keep building on the foundation he was given, refusing every opportunity to let the work stop simply because it had already succeeded once." Izuku, sitting with the accumulated weight of Shadow's reflection and the considerable correspondence that had prompted it, felt the full and complete gratitude of a journey that had, across 17 extraordinary years, traveled considerably further than he had ever dared to imagine on that first, frightened evening beside the park bench, and understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, that the story was nowhere near finished unfolding. He spent a portion of that evening, once Shadow had departed and the apartment had settled into its familiar, comfortable quiet, composing careful, personal replies to a handful of the correspondence that had struck him most deeply, a young quirkless boy in a neighboring prefecture who described feeling exactly the isolation Izuku himself remembered so vividly from his own childhood, a mother writing on behalf of her daughter, hesitant and uncertain about whether her family's circumstances might ever allow access to the kind of mentorship that had once changed everything for Izuku himself, an older reader, well past the age of formal hero training, who wrote simply to say that the story of a stranger's patient belief had reminded her, unexpectedly and powerfully, of her own long-buried capacity to begin again in an entirely different area of her life, one she had quietly assumed was close to her for good. Izuku answered each letter with the same careful, considered attention he brought to every genuinely significant task, understanding, as he wrote, that these small, individual exchanges, multiplied many times over across the accumulated years of his continued public life, represented their own quiet, essential continuation of exactly the gift Shadow had once offered him, the simple, powerful act of telling someone, clearly and without reservation, that they were worth the effort of becoming something more, long before the world had offered them any proof that such an effort would succeed. He kept copies of each reply in a small, carefully organized folder, a habit he had developed years earlier without quite articulating to himself why it mattered, though he understood now, writing late into that particular evening, that some part of him had always known these small, unglamorous exchanges would eventually accumulate into their own significant, if quieter, testament to everything the original gift had ultimately grown into, one letter and one grateful reader at a time. Chapter 86. Success. Izuku had learned across nearly 2 decades of accumulated professional experience, rarely arrived without generating its own particular, complicated forms of resistance, and the mentorship programs continued. Considerable growth proved no exception to that hard-won principle. The formal guidelines adoption and the program's expanding international reach had, in the months following their announcement, drawn not merely the widespread admiration and grateful correspondence Izuku had grown accustomed to receiving, but also a smaller, more vocal contingent of skeptics and outright critics whose objections, initially dismissible as the ordinary friction any significant institutional change tended to generate, gradually coalesced into something considerably more organized and, in its own way, genuinely concerning. The criticism arrived first through conventional channels, opinion pieces, and public commentary questioning whether a training methodology built around one extraordinary individual's singular experience could genuinely translate into a reliable, generalizable approach applicable to the broader population of quirkless and underpowered students the program now served. Izuku, accustomed to public scrutiny across his many years of prominent professional life, initially treated this skepticism as the ordinary, healthy friction of legitimate institutional debate, engaging thoughtfully with the more substantive critiques while declining to dignify the less genuine, more inflammatory commentary with direct response. The tenor of the opposition shifted, however, in ways that troubled Izuku considerably more, once a formal advocacy organization emerged, calling itself the Coalition for Natural Hero Development, whose stated mission centered on what its founders characterized as the dangerous dilution of quirk-based hero training standards, and whose underlying philosophy, Izuku recognized with growing unease as he studied the organization's public materials, carried uncomfortable echoes of exactly the kind of quirk supremacist thinking the League of Villains' original, more violent expression had once claimed, however cynically, to be rebelling against. They're not wrong that natural quirk development matters, Izuku told Momo, the two of them reviewing the coalition's latest public statement during one of their now regular evening strategy sessions, the demands of managing this unexpected new challenge having introduced its own considerable weight into the family's accumulated, well-established rhythms. What troubles me is the implication underneath it. That students without strong natural quirks don't deserve the same investment, the same serious consideration for a genuine hero career. That's not a legitimate pedagogical critique. That's the exact belief this entire program was built to push back against. Momo, her own considerable analytical rigor applied now to understanding the coalition's organizational structure and funding sources, offered her characteristically thorough assessment. Their public rhetoric is careful, deliberately so, she said. They frame it as concern for training standards and safety, not as outright opposition to quirkless students pursuing hero careers. But the underlying logic, once you trace it through consistently, does lead exactly where you're describing. I think we need to take this more seriously than we initially did. Organizations like this rarely remain merely rhetorical for very long, once they've built sufficient momentum and funding. Tsuyu, listening to the conversation with her characteristic calm, practical attention, offered her own grounded addition. Have they made any direct moves against the program itself, she asked. Or is this still confined to public commentary and organizing? Still mostly rhetoric, for now, Izuku confirmed. But I've started hearing concerning reports from a few of our newer international partner programs, discrete pressure campaigns targeting local funding and institutional support, apparently traceable back to affiliated groups operating under the coalition's broader ideological umbrella. I don't think this stays confined to rhetoric for very much longer. Chapter 87. The coalition's opposition escalated considerably over the following months, its influence extending beyond public commentary into more concrete, institutional pressure that began, gradually but unmistakably, to threaten the continued stability of several of the mentorship program's international partnerships. Funding withdrawals and administrative obstacles emerging at partner institutions with a pattern and timing that made clear, to anyone paying careful attention, that the resistance had moved well beyond simple philosophical disagreement into deliberate, coordinated institutional sabotage. Izuku found himself, in this period, drawn into a considerably more political and administrative dimension of his continued work than he had ever previously needed to navigate, his accumulated years of professional standing and public trust proving essential assets as he worked, alongside Hana, Momo, and a growing coalition of allied institutions and supportive government officials, to shore up the program's institutional foundations against the coalition's mounting, coordinated pressure. "I never expected this part of the work either," Izuku admitted to Shadow, during one of their continued evening sessions, the accumulated stress of the preceding month's political maneuvering carrying its own particular, unfamiliar weight that his years of physical and tactical training had never fully prepared him to manage. "Fighting villains, I understand. Fighting institutional opposition dressed up in the careful, respectable language of policy debate, that's a considerably different kind of battle." Shadow, listening with his characteristic careful attention, offered his own measured perspective. "The tactics differ," he said. "The underlying principle does not. You are facing an opponent who has decided that certain people do not deserve the same consideration, the same opportunity, as others, and who has organized themselves to act on that belief. Whether that opponent wields a quirk directly or wields institutional funding and political influence, the fundamental confrontation remains the same. You have spent your entire life learning to meet exactly this kind of challenge, disciplined resistance against forces that would deny someone the chance to become something more. I do not believe this particular battlefield requires skills you do not already possess. It simply requires you to apply them in an unfamiliar arena." The confrontation reached its most significant point some months later, when the coalition, having built sufficient public momentum through its sustained campaign, succeeded in securing a formal legislative hearing intended to review and potentially restrict national funding and accreditation standards for foundational discipline programs, a hearing that would, if the coalition's preferred outcome prevailed, threaten the continued institutional viability of the entire methodology Izuku had spent nearly 2 decades building. "I need you there," Izuku told Hana, as the two of them prepared for the hearing with the same careful, methodical rigor they had once applied to Hana's own original training. "Not just as my colleague. As proof, living and undeniable, of exactly what this program actually produces. They can argue about theoretical dilution of standards all they want. They can't argue with what you've actually built with your own life and career." Hana, her own considerable professional standing having grown, across the preceding years, into its own significant and respected authority, met the request with the same fierce, disciplined determination that had first carried her through her own uncertain, difficult beginning. "I'll be there," she said. "And I intend to make certain every single person in that hearing room understands exactly what's actually at stake, for kids exactly like the one I used to be." Chapter 88. The legislative hearing, held in the considerable formal chamber of the National Commission's primary headquarters, drew a substantial audience of policymakers, media representatives, and interested stakeholders from across the broader hero community, the coalition's carefully organized presentation opening the proceedings with a polished, superficially reasonable case for restricting the methodology's continued funding and institutional support, framed throughout in the careful, deliberately measured language of legitimate concern for training standards and student safety. Izuku listened to the coalition's opening presentation with the same careful, disciplined attention he brought to every significant confrontation, cataloging each argument's underlying assumptions and logical structure with the same rigorous analytical precision Shadow had first taught him to apply to combat scenarios years earlier, recognizing, beneath the presentation's careful surface politeness, the same fundamental belief in inherited, quirk-based worth that had once defined the League of Dylan's original, more violently expressed ideology. When his own turn to respond finally arrived, Izuku approached the chamber's central podium with the calm, settled confidence of nearly 2 decades of hard-won, accumulated experience, and delivered a response that drew, in equal measure, on his own extraordinary personal journey and on the considerable, carefully documented evidence of the methodology's broader, demonstrated success across the thousands of students it had, by this point, directly and indirectly touched. "The coalition's presentation this morning speaks a great deal about maintaining rigorous standards," Izuku told the assembled hearing, his voice carrying the calm, unwavering conviction of someone who had spent his entire adult life proving exactly the opposite of what the coalition's underlying assumptions suggested. I agree entirely that rigorous standards matter. Where I disagree is in the implicit suggestion that rigor and inclusion are somehow in tension with one another, that maintaining genuine excellence requires excluding students whose path to that excellence looks different from the conventional, Quirk-first model this profession has historically assumed was the only legitimate one. He gestured toward Hannah, seated in the chamber's gallery alongside a small delegation of the program's other notable graduates. I would ask this committee to consider the actual, documented evidence before them, rather than the theoretical concerns the coalition has presented today. Hana Fujimori entered this program as an 11-year-old girl with no quirk at all, and no realistic path toward a hero career under the conventional standards the coalition apparently wishes to restore. She now stands among the most respected instructors this methodology has produced, her own students achieving results that speak for themselves considerably more persuasively than any theoretical argument either side of this hearing might offer. The hearing's subsequent testimony, drawing on Hannah's own powerful, personal account alongside carefully documented data from programs across the country and internationally, gradually shifted the chamber's evidence sentiment, the coalition's careful, polished rhetoric proving considerably less persuasive when directly confronted with the accumulated, undeniable evidence of genuine, demonstrated success spanning nearly 2 decades and thousands of individual students' transformed lives and careers. Chapter 89. The hearing's eventual outcome, delivered through a formal committee ruling some weeks later, rejected the coalition's proposed funding restrictions in their entirety, instead affirming and, in several meaningful respects, strengthening the methodology's continued institutional standing and national accreditation, a decisive, considerable victory that Izuku received with a profound, settled relief that carried, beneath its evident satisfaction, an equally profound exhaustion at the accumulated weight of the preceding month's sustained institutional battle. I don't think I fully appreciated, before all of this, how much energy fighting for something's continued existence actually requires, Izuku admitted to Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, the 4 of them gathered at their familiar apartment in the days following the ruling's announcement, the accumulated relief of the resolved crisis settling gradually into something closer to genuine, restorative rest. Building something new felt hard, but it also felt exciting, generative. Defending something already built against people determined to tear it down felt considerably more draining, in ways I don't think I was fully prepared for. Ochako, settling close beside him with the same warm, steady affection that had carried them both through nearly 2 decades of accumulated challenge, offered her own gentle, grounding perspective. You didn't fight that battle alone, though, she reminded him. Hannah was there. We were there. An entire coalition of allied institutions and supportive officials rallied around what you built, because what you built actually mattered to them, not just abstractly, but in ways they could point to directly in their own communities and their own students' lives. That's not nothing. That's actually the clearest possible evidence that the program's foundation is genuinely solid, not fragile. Tsuyu, offering her own characteristically calm, practical observation, added a further, grounding thought. I think it's also worth remembering that opposition like this was probably always going to arrive eventually, she said. Anything genuinely significant enough to matter is eventually going to attract people determined to tear it down. The fact that it took nearly 2 decades for organized opposition of this scale to even emerge speaks to how solidly you built the foundation in the first place. A weaker program would have attracted this kind of challenge considerably earlier, and probably wouldn't have survived it nearly as decisively. Shadow, present for a portion of the gathering, offered his own characteristically dry but genuinely warm assessment of the entire, extended confrontation. I did not train you for legislative hearings, Shadow observed. I confess I did not anticipate, all those years ago, that the discipline I was building into you would eventually need to extend into that particular arena. But I find, watching how thoroughly you met the challenge regardless, that the underlying principle held exactly as it always has. You did not back down from a fight simply because the battlefield was unfamiliar. You adapted, methodically and completely, exactly the way 7 years of training once taught you to adapt to anything the world decided to throw at you. The following weeks brought their own quieter, more restorative rhythm, the program's institutional victory settling into the accumulated, secure foundation of everything Izuku's continued work had built across nearly 2 decades, and Izuku found himself, gradually, allowing the accumulated exhaustion of the preceding month's sustained institutional battle to give way to a renewed, grateful appreciation for exactly how much genuine, hard-won stability that battle had ultimately secured, not merely for himself, but for the thousands of students, present and future, whose own extraordinary journeys the methodology's continued institutional survival would now make possible. Chapter 90. The institutional victory, while significant, did not fully resolve the underlying ideological tension the Coalition for Natural Hero Development had, in its months of organized opposition, brought back into uncomfortable public focus, and Izuku found himself, in the months that followed the hearing's resolution, drawn into a broader, more sustained public conversation about the fundamental values underlying the entire hero profession, a conversation he approached with the same careful, deliberate thoughtfulness he had always brought to genuinely significant questions. I don't think the goal was ever to defeat people who think differently, Izuku told a gathered audience during a public forum organized in the aftermath of the hearing, one of several such engagements he accepted in the following months, recognizing in each an opportunity to address the underlying questions more directly and thoughtfully than the adversarial context of the legislative hearing itself had allowed. I think the goal is to keep demonstrating, clearly and consistently, that worth isn't something a person is born with or without. It's something built, through discipline and effort and the willingness of someone else to believe in you before you've proven anything. I understand why that idea threatens people invested in a worldview where inherited power determines inherited worth. I don't think shouting that threat down is the answer. I think continuing to build, continuing to demonstrate, continuing to produce heroes like Hana whose lives speak for themselves, that's the answer. It always has been. The forum's question and answer session that followed brought Izuku into direct, respectful conversation with several audience members who identified themselves as sympathetic to at least some of the coalition's underlying concerns, and Izuku, rather than dismissing their perspectives outright, engaged with genuine, careful attention, recognizing in the exchange an opportunity to model exactly the kind of thoughtful, principled engagement he hoped might gradually shift the broader public conversation away from the more polarized, adversarial framing the preceding month's institutional battle had understandably encouraged. I understand the instinct to worry that changing standards might dilute something valuable, Izuku told one particularly earnest questioner, a young man who had identified himself as a current hero course student with a naturally powerful combat quirk and genuine, if somewhat defensive, concerns about the mentorship program's growing influence. I'd ask you to consider, though, whether the standards you're worried about diluting were ever actually about genuine capability, or whether they were built, unconsciously perhaps, around the specific kind of capability that happened to favor people born with strong natural quirks. I'm not trying to tear down what already works. I'm trying to expand what counts as working, to include people the old standards simply never had room for in the first place. The young man, visibly turning the response over with genuine, considered attention rather than reflexive defensiveness, offered his own thoughtful, uncertain response. I hadn't thought about it that way, he admitted. I think I just assumed the standards were neutral, objective, not built around any particular kind of advantage. Most standards feel neutral to the people they were built to favor, Izuku said, gently rather than accusingly. That's usually how bias works. It doesn't feel like bias from the inside. It just feels like the natural order of things. I'm not asking you to feel guilty about that. I'm just asking you to consider whether the standards deserve more scrutiny than their apparent neutrality initially suggests. Chapter 91. The broader public conversation Izuku's careful, sustained engagement helped cultivate in the months following the hearing gradually produced its own meaningful, if incremental, shifts in the wider hero community's collective understanding. Several previously skeptical institutions and individual heroes publicly revising their positions in light of the accumulated evidence and thoughtful argument the preceding months had brought into sharper, more widely accessible focus. Even the coalition itself, though it did not formally dissolve entirely, found its membership and public influence gradually diminishing over the following year, its more moderate members drifting quietly away as the organization's continued rhetoric increasingly struggled to compete against the mounting, undeniable evidence of the methodology's genuine, demonstrated success, leaving behind only its most committed, ideologically entrenched core, a diminished remnant whose continued opposition. Izuku had, by this point, largely learned to treat as background noise rather than genuine institutional threat. I think we won, in the end, not because we out-argued them in any single, decisive exchange, Izuku reflected to Shadow, during one of their continued evening conversations some months after the hearing's resolution, but because we kept building, kept producing results that spoke for themselves more persuasively than any argument either side could offer. I think that might be the actual lesson underneath this entire confrontation. You don't defeat bad ideas primarily through better rhetoric. You defeat them by continuing to demonstrate, patiently and repeatedly, that the alternative genuinely works. Shadow, considering this reflection with his characteristic thoughtful attention, offered his own measured agreement. That has always been the truest form of the lesson I originally offered you, all those years ago, he said. Power is not something you argue your way into possessing. It is something you build, deliberately, until the evidence of what you have built becomes undeniable to anyone honestly willing to look at it. I am not surprised that the same principle proved decisive here, in an arena considerably removed from the physical training where I first taught it to you. The renewed public attention Izuku's engagement with these broader questions generated brought with it its own considerable, meaningful expansion of the mentorship program's reach and influence, several additional countries and institutions reaching out in the following months to establish their own local versions of the methodology, drawing on the accumulated, publicly documented evidence of both the program's demonstrated success and its recent, decisive institutional vindication before the Legislative Committee. Hannah, whose own public testimony during the hearing had established her as a genuinely significant public figure in her own right, found herself increasingly sought out, in the months that followed, for her own independent consulting and advocacy work, a development that filled Izuku with a particular, powerful satisfaction as he watched his former student step fully and completely into a role considerably larger than even his own original hopes for her had ever anticipated. You've become your own version of what Shadow was to me, Izuku told her, during a quiet conversation at their now treasured familiar spot by the river, watching Hannah review a considerable stack of correspondence from institutions across the world seeking her own direct guidance and consultation on matters both large and small. Not just carrying the methodology forward. Becoming your own independent source of exactly the kind of belief and advocacy that once changed everything for both of us. I had a good example to follow, Hannah said, and the warmth of the acknowledgement settled comfortably between them, the accumulated weight of an entire extraordinary legacy continuing to extend itself outward, generously and completely, into a future that showed no sign, even now, of reaching any natural or necessary limit, however far it eventually managed to travel. Chapter 92. The following spring brought its own significant, treasured milestone, the 20th anniversary of Shadow's original arrival in this world and his fateful decision to approach a grieving, quirkless boy on a park bench, an occasion the extended family marked with a gathering considerably larger and more elaborate than even their well-established annual tradition typically produced, drawing together not merely the immediate family but a considerable extended circle of former students, colleagues, and allies whose lives had, in ways large and small, been shaped by the accumulated ripples of that single, original choice. Izuku's mother, now considerably older but carrying the exact same steady, unwavering warmth that had defined her presence across the entirety of her son's extraordinary life, offered her own reflective toast during the gathering's warm, extended celebration, her voice carrying the particular emotion of a parent who had witnessed, across 2 full decades, the complete and remarkable transformation of a frightened, quirkless boy into someone whose extraordinary journey had touched thousands of lives he would never personally meet. I remember the exact evening he came home and told me about the hedgehog on the park bench, Inko told the gathered assembly, her voice carrying a warm, affectionate laughter beneath its evident, considerable emotion. I thought, for just a moment, that my son had finally cracked under the pressure of everything the diagnosis had put him through. I did not believe, not for a single second, that the story was actually true. I certainly did not believe, sitting at that kitchen table listening to my son's careful, earnest explanation, that I was witnessing the very beginning of everything that has since unfolded. I am so grateful, more than I could ever adequately express, that I was wrong to doubt him, even for that brief, uncertain moment. Shadow, listening to this account with the particular, quiet warmth that had, across 2 decades, become his most treasured response to the family's continued celebration of everything their shared history had built, offered his own brief, characteristically understated addition to the evening's reflective proceedings. 20 long years, Shadow observed, settling onto the familiar low stone wall with the same careful stillness that had first caught a grieving boy's attention 2 full decades earlier. I did not anticipate, when I first arrived in this world, that a single evening's decision would extend this completely, this far beyond anything I could have reasonably imagined at the time, all those years ago when I was still a stranger to everything and everyone gathered here tonight. I have watched a frightened boy become a hero, a mentor, and now something considerably larger still, a source of hope and possibility for people scattered across this entire world and, apparently, even into the world I once called my own. I do not believe I have adequate words to properly express what witnessing this transformation has meant to me, across these 20 extraordinary and genuinely remarkable years. I will simply say that I remain, even now, profoundly and completely grateful that I chose to sit down beside that particular park bench, on that particular quiet evening, all those years ago. Chapter 93. The gathering's later hours brought Izuku into a quieter, more private conversation with Hana, the two of them stepping away from the celebration's warm, crowded main gathering to find their own familiar spot along the riverbank, the accumulated weight of 2 decades of shared history settling comfortably between them as they looked out over the same quietly moving water that had witnessed so much of both their extraordinary, intertwined journeys. I've been thinking about starting my own version of this, Hana admitted, during the conversation's reflective quiet, her voice carrying a thoughtfulness that had clearly been building for some time before this particular conversation. Not just consulting for other programs. Something more personal. A student of my own, the way you once had me. Izuku, hearing in her admission an echo of exactly the kind of deliberate, generous continuation the entire legacy had always been building toward, felt a particular, powerful satisfaction settle into him at the prospect. That's a wonderful idea, he said. Do you have someone in mind already? Hana nodded, her expression carrying the same serious, careful consideration she brought to every significant decision. A boy in one of the newer international programs, she said. Quirkless, like both of us were. Talented, but struggling with exactly the kind of isolation and self-doubt I remember carrying myself, before you found me. I think I could help him, the same way you helped me. I just wanted you to know, before I actually reach out to him, that I'm planning to try. I think you're going to be wonderful at it, Izuku said, with complete and settled certainty. You already understand, better than almost anyone else could, exactly what he needs to hear, and exactly how patient the process is going to require you to be. I have complete faith in you, Hana. I always have, since that very first day you walked into the program looking terrified and trying not to show it. Hana's answering smile carried the particular warmth of someone receiving exactly the validation she had needed, even after years of her own considerable, independently earned professional success. That means more than I can easily say, coming from you, she admitted. I don't think I'll ever stop needing to hear it, honestly, however accomplished I eventually become in my own right. Then I'll keep saying it, Izuku said, echoing, without quite realizing the callback, almost the exact words Shadow had once offered him during a similarly reflective conversation years earlier. As many times as you need to hear it. The two of them sat together in the comfortable, familiar quiet for a while longer, the celebration's warm sounds carrying faintly from the gathering behind them, and Izuku, looking out over the river that had witnessed the entirety of his own extraordinary transformation and was now, in its own quiet way, witnessing the continued extension of that same transformation into an entirely new generation, felt the full, complete weight of everything 2 decades of deliberate, patient choice had ultimately built settle into something he understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, would continue extending outward, indefinitely, for as long as anyone remained willing to keep choosing it. Chapter 94. Hana's decision to take on her own individual student unfolded, in the months that followed, with the same careful, deliberate rigor that had defined her own original training under Izuku's mentorship. The boy she had identified, a quiet, serious 11-year-old named Rinji Okada from one of the program's newer international branches, proving, across their early sessions together, to carry exactly the kind of stubborn, quiet determination that Hana recognized, with powerful and immediate familiarity, as an echo of her own long-ago beginning. I keep seeing myself in him, Hana admitted to Izuku, during one of their now regular check-in conversations, the accumulated weight of her own new mentorship responsibilities settling into her with a gravity she had not fully anticipated despite years of watching Izuku carry the same weight himself. It's strange, being on this side of it. I understand, in a completely new way, exactly how much you must have been carrying, all those years, watching me struggle and trying to decide exactly how much to push and exactly when to simply be patient instead. Izuku, listening with the same warm, knowing attention he had always brought to Hana's continued growth, offered his own gentle, considered reassurance. It doesn't get easier, exactly, he said. But it does get more familiar. You learn to trust your own instincts about when to push and when to hold back, the same way I eventually learned to trust mine. I have complete confidence you're already developing exactly that instinct with Renji. I've seen the reports from his other instructors. He's responding to your particular approach in ways that suggest you already understand him better than you're giving yourself credit for. Renji's own early training progressed, across the following months, through the same careful, patient arc that had once carried Hana through her own uncertain beginning, his initial struggles with the programs demanding physical conditioning gradually giving way to the settled, integrated strength of genuine, hard-won progress, and Hana found herself, watching his development unfold, drawing increasingly on her own remembered experience to anticipate exactly which particular struggles and breakthroughs he was likely to encounter next. You told me, once, that you were competing against yesterday's version of yourself, not against your classmates, Hana told Renji, during a particularly difficult training session when his own frustration at a repeatedly failed drill had begun visibly building toward the same kind of discouraged tears she remembered shedding herself, all those years earlier, in front of Izuku. I'm going to tell you the exact same thing, because it's exactly as true for you as it was for me. I promise you, the version of yourself from a year from now is going to look back at this exact moment and recognize it as the beginning of something, not the proof of some limitation you were always going to be stuck with. Renji, wiping at his own eyes with the same embarrassed fierceness Hana remembered from her own early training, absorbed this with careful, serious attention. How do you know that? He asked, the question carrying the same desperate need for certainty Hana remembered asking Izuku, all those years earlier, in this exact same construction site turned training facility. I don't know it for certain, Hana admitted honestly, echoing, without quite realizing the deliberate callback, almost the exact words Izuku had once offered her in response to the identical question. I just decided that continuing felt better than the alternative, exactly the way someone once told me it did. Certainty came later, once there was enough evidence behind me to actually support it. I can't promise you certainty right now either. I can only promise you that the work is worth doing regardless of whether the certainty ever fully arrives, and that I'm not going anywhere while you find that out for yourself. Chapter 95. The parallel unfolding of Renji's training alongside Hana's own continued professional development brought its own particular, meaningful satisfaction to the broader family gathering, Izuku finding himself, watching the careful, deliberate echo of his own original relationship with Shadow now replicating itself through an entirely new generation, experiencing a depth of fulfillment that felt, in its own way, considerably more significant than even his own considerable personal and professional achievements across the preceding 2 decades. This is what I always hoped the legacy would eventually become, Izuku told Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, during one of their continued evening gatherings, the 4 of them reviewing recent updates on Renji's steady, encouraging progress with the same warm, invested attention they had once brought to Hana's own original training years earlier. Not just me passing forward what Shadow gave me. An entire chain, extending outward, each link finding their own way to carry it forward to someone new. Momo, her own considerable analytical mind turning toward the broader implications of this continuing pattern, offered her own thoughtful observation. I think what's remarkable is how the fundamental principles remain consistent, even as each individual relationship develops its own distinct character, she said. Shadow's approach with you carried a certain flat, exacting quality that reflected his own particular history and temperament. Your approach with Hana carried more warmth, more explicit emotional support, reflecting your own particular journey and what you understood, from direct experience, that a struggling quirkless child most needed to hear. Now Hana's approach with Renji is developing its own distinct character too, shaped by everything she's learned from both of you, filtered through her own particular understanding of what he specifically needs. The methodology holds steady. The human relationship built on top of it keeps finding its own unique expression, generation after generation. Tsuyu, offering her own characteristically grounded edition, extended the observation further still. I think that's probably the actual secret to why this keeps working, she said. If it were just a rigid, unchanging formula, it would eventually become brittle, unable to adapt to each new student's particular needs. But because each mentor brings their own genuine, lived understanding to the relationship, it stays alive, responsive, capable of continuing to work even as it spreads further and further from where it originally started. Ochako, listening to this thoughtful exchange with her own characteristic warmth, offered the evening's final, simplest observation. I just think it's beautiful, she said. Watching something built from one desperate, uncertain evening beside a park bench grow into something with its own family tree now, branches extending in directions none of us could have possibly predicted when this all began. I don't think there's a more complete measure of how much Shadow's original choice actually mattered than watching it keep multiplying like this, year after year, student after student. Izuku, absorbing the warmth and insight of each of their observations, felt the accumulated weight of the entire, extraordinary legacy settle into something he recognized, with complete and unshakable certainty, as considerably larger and more significant than he had ever fully allowed himself to appreciate in the midst of the preceding months' institutional battles and public advocacy work, a recognition that carried its own quiet, humbling gratitude alongside the evident pride. The legacy was not merely surviving its recent challenges. It was thriving, deepening, extending itself into new generations with a vitality that suggested it had, at some point across the preceding 2 decades, transcended his own individual effort entirely, becoming something considerably larger and more resilient than any single person's continued involvement could ever fully account for on its own. Chapter 96. Renji's own eventual test arrived, as such tests inevitably did, during an unplanned crisis considerably earlier in his training than either Hana or Izuku would have deliberately chosen, a sudden, severe flooding event at his home region requiring emergency evacuation and rescue efforts that drew, unexpectedly, on the full extent of his still developing capability, testing him under genuine, considerable pressure well before his formal training had reached the stage where such testing would typically occur. Hana, alerted to the crisis through the same urgent regional emergency networks that had first brought her own program's international expansion to broader attention, made the rapid, difficult decision to travel immediately to Renji's home region, arriving to find him already engaged, alongside local emergency responders, in the desperate, urgent work of evacuating stranded residents from the rapidly rising floodwaters, his still developing training nonetheless proving sufficient to the crisis's immediate, pressing demands. I didn't think, I just moved, Renji told her afterward, once the immediate crisis had settled and the region's emergency response had stabilized sufficiently to allow a moment's reflection, his voice carrying the same fierce, focused calm Hana remembered from her own first genuine crisis, years earlier, at the exhibition attack that had first tested her own developing capability under real and considerable danger. There wasn't time to think. I just remembered everything you taught me, and my body just did it, before I even had time to be scared. Hana, hearing in his account an unmistakable, powerful echo of her own long-ago experience, felt a swell of complicated, profound pride settle into her, the particular satisfaction of watching a student's training prove genuinely, decisively sufficient to a crisis considerably larger than either of them had anticipated needing to face so early in his development. That's exactly what the training is supposed to do, Hana told him, gentle but firm in her evident pride. Build instinct strong enough that it moves before fear has the chance to freeze you. You did exactly what you were supposed to do, Renji. I am so proud of you. The crisis's broader outcome, once fully documented and assessed, revealed a genuinely significant number of lives saved through the combined, urgent efforts of the region's emergency responders and the small handful of trained hero candidates, Renji among them, who had happened to be present and capable of contributing meaningfully to the response. And the considerable public attention the crisis subsequently drew brought Renji's own remarkable early demonstration of capability to broader Notice, echoing, in its own way, the exact trajectory that had once carried both Izuku and Hana from uncertain, struggling students into figures of genuine, demonstrated capability and public recognition. Izuku, receiving word of the crisis and Renji's own remarkable performance through Hana's own considerable, evident pride, found himself reflecting, once again, on the particular, powerful truth that continued to define the entire, extraordinary legacy across its now 3 full generations of deliberate, patient continuation, that the discipline, once genuinely built into a person, held steady and reliable regardless of how early or unexpectedly circumstance ultimately demanded its full and complete demonstration. The chain keeps proving itself, Izuku told Shadow, during their next evening conversation, the weight of Renji's remarkable, unexpected test settling into him with the particular satisfaction of watching an entire, extraordinary legacy continue validating itself, generation after generation, student after student. Every single time, someone new proves that the fundamental principle holds. Discipline built patiently, deliberately, genuinely, doesn't fail simply because the moment it's needed arrives sooner or more unexpectedly than anyone planned for. Chapter 97. The years that followed carried the entire, extraordinary family through their own continued, accumulating rhythm of growth and celebration, Renji's own eventual graduation into a promising professional career echoing, in its own particular way, the exact pattern that had first carried Izuku from a frightened, quirkless boy into a respected hero, then carried Hana along the same essential path, and now carried Renji forward in turn, each generation building on the foundation the ones before it had established, each carrying their own distinct, individual character forward into a legacy that showed no sign, even now, of losing its essential vitality or momentum. Izuku found himself, in this later stage of his own extraordinary career, settling into a role that felt, in its own way, like the natural and fitting culmination of everything the preceding decades had built, less the primary, active hero he had once been in his younger years, though he remained considerably capable and continued accepting select, significant professional engagements, and increasingly the senior statesman and guiding figure of an entire, thriving movement that had long since grown beyond what any single person's direct, individual effort could have possibly sustained alone. I think I understand now, in a way I couldn't have fully understood when I was younger, exactly what Shadow must have felt, watching me grow into my own independence, Izuku reflected to Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, during one of the family's continued, treasured evening gatherings, the accumulated weight of watching an entire third generation now carrying the legacy forward settling into him with its own particular, profound satisfaction. There's a specific kind of joy in watching something you built become genuinely, completely independent of you. Not because you're no longer needed, but because what you built was always meant to eventually stand on its own, to keep growing in directions you couldn't have fully anticipated or controlled yourself. Momo, her own considerable career having reached its own significant, respected culmination across the preceding decades, offered her own thoughtful, considered response. I think that might be the truest measure of anything genuinely worth building, she said. Not whether it depends entirely on its original creator to survive, but whether it's built solid and adaptable enough to keep thriving, keep evolving, long after that original creator has stepped back into a quieter, more supportive role. I think you built exactly that, Izuku. Something considerably larger and more enduring than any single person's continued direct involvement could ever fully account for. The gathering continued long into the warm evening, the accumulated family, 3 full generations deep now and still growing, settling into the familiar, treasured rhythm that had, across more than 2 decades, become the truest and most complete measure of everything a single, deliberate choice beside a lonely park bench had ultimately managed to build, extending outward, generously and completely, into a future that showed no sign, even now, of reaching its natural or necessary conclusion. And Izuku, looking around at the accumulated warmth of everyone gathered, felt, once again, the full and complete gratitude of a life built patiently, deliberately, and completely, one honest choice at a time, across more years than he had ever imagined, on that first frightened evening, he would ever be fortunate enough to have. Chapter 98. A quiet afternoon some months later brought Izuku an unexpected visitor at the mentorship program's original facility, a woman he did not immediately recognize, though something in her careful, watchful bearing struck him with an unplaceable, nagging familiarity the moment she introduced herself. "My name is Yuki Tanaka," she said, extending her hand with a formal, careful politeness that carried its own particular weight. "I don't expect you to remember me. I was a student in the very first cohort of your program, nearly 2 decades ago now. I left after only a few months. I wasn't ready, back then, for what the training actually demanded of me. I've thought about that decision more than you might imagine, across all the years since." Izuku, searching his memory across the accumulated weight of nearly 20 years and thousands of students, found the recognition arriving slowly but with growing, certain clarity, a quiet, uncertain girl whose early departure from the program's original pilot cohort had, at the time, registered as one of his few genuine early disappointments, a student whose particular struggles he had not managed to adequately address before she had, ultimately, chosen to leave. "I remember you," Izuku said, and meant it completely, the memory arriving now with full, considered weight. "I remember wishing I had done more, at the time, to help you find a way to stay. I've thought about that too, more than once, across the years since." Yuki's expression carried a complicated mixture of emotions at this admission, relief and lingering old hurt intermingling in a way that suggested the intervening years had not fully resolved whatever difficult feelings her early departure had left behind. "I didn't come here for an apology," she said. "I came here because I wanted you to know what happened after I left. I want you to understand that the story didn't end the way you might have assumed it did, watching me walk away all those years ago." The account that followed carried Izuku through nearly 2 decades of a life he had never fully known the shape of, Yuki's departure from the program having led, through a winding, difficult path that included considerable personal struggle and eventual, hard-won self-discovery, not to the hero career the program had originally been designed to cultivate, but to an entirely different, equally significant form of contribution, a career in emergency medicine that had, across the intervening years, saved countless lives through skill and dedication considerably different from, but no less valuable than, the conventional hero pathway her early training had once pointed toward. "I left your program because I realized, slowly and painfully, that the specific path you were building me toward wasn't actually the right path for me," Yuki explained. "Not because the discipline itself was wrong, or because I wasn't capable of the work. Because I discovered, through the process of trying and eventually failing at that particular path, exactly what I actually wanted to do instead. The discipline you taught me during those few months, the foundational habits of persistence and careful, patient effort, those came with me anyway, into an entirely different career than the one your program was originally designed to produce. I think I owe you more gratitude than I ever properly expressed, for giving me that foundation, even though I ultimately built something different on top of it than either of us originally expected." Chapter 99. Yuki's unexpected visit and the account she carried with her prompted Izuku into a period of genuine, considered reflection on a dimension of the mentorship program's legacy he had not previously given sufficient, deliberate attention. The students whose journeys, like Yuki's own, had ultimately diverged from the conventional hero career pathway the program had originally been designed to cultivate, but who had nonetheless carried forward, into entirely different fields and pursuits, the same foundational discipline and belief in their own capability that the program's core methodology had first instilled in them. "I think I've been measuring the program's success too narrowly," Izuku admitted to Hana, during one of their continued, regular check-in conversations, the accumulated weight of Yuki's unexpected revelation settling into a broader, more complete understanding of everything the methodology had actually accomplished across its nearly 2 decades of operation. "I've been counting successful hero careers. I haven't been adequately counting the students who took what we taught them and built something different, but equally valuable, somewhere else entirely." Hana, considering this reflection with her own characteristic thoughtful attention, offered her own measured, considered response. "I think that might actually be the deeper, truer measure of what Shadow originally gave you," she said. "He didn't just teach you to become a hero. He taught you discipline, foundational capability, the belief that you were worth the effort of becoming something more. The hero career was simply the specific shape that discipline happened to take, in your particular case, given your particular circumstances and the particular power that eventually found you. For other students, that same foundational gift might legitimately take an entirely different shape, and I don't think that represents any kind of failure. I think it represents the methodology working exactly as it should, adapting itself to each individual student's actual path, rather than forcing everyone toward the same narrow, predetermined outcome. This reflection prompted Izuku, in the months that followed, to commission a more comprehensive, deliberate study of the program's full alumni network, an effort that revealed, once properly documented and analyzed, a considerably richer and more varied tapestry of outcomes than the program's public narrative, focused as it had understandably been on its most visible hero career success stories, had previously captured or adequately celebrated. The study's findings, published eventually as a considered, thoughtful addendum to the program's existing formal guidelines, documented graduates who had gone on to build meaningful, impactful careers not merely as heroes, but as emergency responders, educators, community organizers, and countless other pursuits where the foundational discipline the program instilled had proven, time and again, to translate meaningfully into genuine, significant contribution, regardless of whether that contribution ultimately took the specific shape of a formal, licensed hero career. I think this might be the most important thing we've published in the entire history of the program, Izuku told the assembled team who had helped compile the study, during its formal presentation to the broader mentorship network. Not because it changes what we teach. Because it changes how we measure whether the teaching actually worked. We're not just building heroes. We're building people capable of choosing their own path with genuine confidence and capability, whatever that path ultimately turns out to be. I think that's actually closer to what Shadow originally gave me than the narrower version of success I've been unconsciously measuring against, all these years. Chapter 100. The revised, broader understanding of the program's true measure of success brought with it its own meaningful evolution in how Izuku and the broader mentorship network approached the ongoing work of guiding new students, the methodology's core discipline and foundational training remaining essentially unchanged, but the framing and eventual goals each individual mentor helped their students work toward expanding to genuinely, deliberately accommodate the full range of paths that discipline and belief in one's own capability might ultimately open, rather than narrowly funneling every student toward the same predetermined hero career outcome. Yuki, whose unexpected visit had prompted this entire, meaningful evolution, found herself invited, in the months that followed, to join the program's advisory council in a newly created role specifically focused on representing and celebrating the experiences of graduates whose paths had diverged from the conventional hero career trajectory, a role she accepted with visible, considerable emotion at finally finding formal, institutional acknowledgement for a journey she had, for many years, privately worried the program and its founder might consider a kind of failure. You never needed to worry about that, Izuku told her, during the small ceremony marking her formal appointment to the advisory council. Not for a single day. What you built, the lives you've saved through your work in emergency medicine, that's every bit as meaningful a continuation of what this program was always meant to build as any hero career could ever be. I'm only sorry it took me this long to properly recognize and celebrate that truth, publicly and completely. The program's evolving, broader framing drew its own renewed wave of public attention and, in its own way, further strengthened its institutional standing against whatever remained of the coalition's diminished but not entirely extinguished opposition. The expanded understanding of the methodology's genuine, demonstrated success across an even wider range of meaningful outcomes proving, if anything, an even more comprehensive and persuasive rebuttal to the narrow, exclusionary worldview the coalition's original opposition had been built upon. Shadow, informed of this latest evolution during one of their continued evening conversations, offered his own quiet, considered reflection on the methodology's continued, deepening growth. I taught you discipline, all those years ago, because I believed it was the single most important foundation a person could possess, regardless of what they eventually chose to build on top of it, Shadow observed. I confess I did not always articulate that belief as clearly or completely as I perhaps should have, in our own original years of training together. I am glad, watching this latest evolution of your work, that the underlying truth has finally found its full, complete expression, nearly 2 decades after I first attempted to teach it to you. I think it just took me this long to fully understand what you were actually trying to give me, Izuku said, the accumulated weight of nearly 2 decades of continued growth and reflection settling into a completeness that felt, in this particular moment, like a genuinely significant culmination of everything the entire, extraordinary journey had been building toward. Not a hero. A person capable of building whatever life genuinely fit them best, with the confidence and discipline to actually follow through on that building, regardless of what specific shape it eventually took. That was always the entire point, Shadow said simply, and the two of them sat together in the familiar, comfortable quiet of their continued, treasured relationship, the accumulated weight of nearly 2 decades of shared history settling into something that felt, in this particular reflective moment, more complete and more fully understood than at any prior point across their long, extraordinary shared journey. Chapter 101. On a warm summer evening some months after Yuki's formal appointment to the advisory council, the entire, extraordinary family gathered once more at the familiar riverside park, the tradition now spanning more than 2 decades of accumulated, treasured history, and Izuku found himself, settling onto the familiar bench beside Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, with Hana and Rinji nearby, Yuki present for the first time among the gathered circle, and his mother, considerably older now but carrying the same steady warmth that had defined her presence across the entirety of his extraordinary life, completing the circle alongside a rotating cast of former students and colleagues whose lives had, in ways large and small, been shaped by the accumulated ripples of a single, original choice. I keep thinking about how much has changed since that very first evening, Izuku said, looking out over the quiet, familiar river as the gathering's warm conversation settled into its evening rhythm. Not just for me. For everyone this legacy has eventually touched. Hana, Rinji, Yuki, all the students none of us will ever personally meet, whose lives were still shaped by something that started right here, on this exact bench, more than 2 decades ago. I still find myself, some evenings, sitting here and trying to properly account for the full scope of it, the way a single conversation with a grieving, quirkless boy eventually rippled outward into something this large, this varied, this alive. I don't think I'll ever fully finish accounting for it, honestly. I'm not sure that's even the point anymore. I think the point is simply to keep showing up, year after year, and letting the accumulated weight of it settle into gratitude rather than disbelief. Shadow, present as he always was for these treasured, accumulated gatherings, offered his own quiet, considered reflection, his red eyes carrying the particular warmth that had, across more than 2 decades, become his most treasured and most complete response to witnessing the continued, extraordinary growth of everything their original choice had ultimately built. I did not anticipate, when I first arrived in this world, uncertain and untethered from everything I had previously known, that a single evening's decision would extend this far, touching this many lives, in ways I could never have possibly predicted or fully controlled, he said. I have come to understand, across these many years, that this is perhaps the truest measure of any genuinely worthwhile choice. Not that it produces a predictable, controllable outcome, but that it sets something meaningful and generous in motion, something capable of growing and adapting and extending itself in directions the original choice could never have fully anticipated, precisely because it was built on a foundation solid and honest enough to support that kind of continued, independent growth. I find, reflecting on this particular evening among so many others, that I remain as grateful now as I was on that very first night, perhaps even more so, having watched the full scope of what that gratitude has since grown into. Rinji, still relatively new to the family's accumulated traditions but already carrying the same serious, thoughtful attention that had first marked both Izuku's and Hana's own early years within the legacy, offered his own quiet, considered addition to the evening's reflective conversation. I think about that sometimes, he admitted. How strange and wonderful it is that I'm here at all, because of a choice made decades before I was even born, by someone who had no way of knowing I would eventually exist, let alone that I would need exactly what that choice ultimately made possible. It makes me want to be careful and deliberate about what I eventually choose to build with everything I've been given. I don't want to waste it. I think about that responsibility often, actually, more than I probably let on to Hana during our regular sessions, though I suspect she already knows exactly how seriously I take it. You won't, Hana told him, with the same warm, unwavering confidence Izuku had once offered her, all those years ago, in this exact spot. I've watched you train, Rinji. I've watched what you did during that flood, when everything you'd learned was tested well before either of us expected it to be. You're not going to waste any of this. You're going to build something worth having, the same way everyone gathered here tonight already has. Yuki, listening to this exchange with her own particular, hard-won understanding of exactly how varied and unpredictable a genuinely worthwhile path could turn out to be, offered her own gentle, encouraging addition, directed as much at Renji as at the gathered family more broadly. I want you to know something, she told him, that I wish someone had told me, all those years ago, when I was still deciding whether to leave the program. Whatever you eventually build, whether it looks exactly like the hero career this program was originally designed to produce, or whether it takes you somewhere entirely different, the way it eventually took me, none of that determines whether the discipline you're learning right now actually mattered. It will matter, regardless. It already does. I promise you that, from someone who spent a long time worrying it might not be true. Momo, listening to the accumulated wisdom being offered around her, found herself reflecting on the particular, remarkable quality of the gathering itself, 3 generations and more of students and mentors, each carrying their own distinct version of the same essential gift forward, each finding their own way to articulate its enduring truth to whoever needed to hear it next. I think what strikes me most, watching this unfold year after year, she said, is how the specific words keep changing, but the underlying message never actually does. Someone is always finding a way to tell the next frightened, uncertain person that they're worth the effort of becoming something more. That's the actual, unbroken thread running through every single person gathered here tonight, however different our individual paths ultimately turned out to be. Tsuyu, settling comfortably beside Izuku with the same steady, grounding presence that had defined her place within the family across more than 2 decades, offered her own quiet, characteristically understated observation to close the reflective exchange. It's a good thread to be part of, she said simply, and no one gathered around the familiar bench found any need to add further words to that particular, complete truth. Izuku's mother, listening to the accumulated wisdom of the evening with the same quiet, attentive warmth she had brought to every significant gathering across the entirety of her son's extraordinary life, offered her own gentle, closing reflection before the gathering's conversation drifted toward lighter, more casual subjects. I think what I find most remarkable, watching all of you tonight, she said, is that none of this required my son to become someone other than who he already was. He didn't have to become hard, or distant, or purely strategic to build everything sitting around this bench tonight. He built it by staying exactly who he always was, underneath all the training and the power and the responsibility, a boy who simply wanted to matter to the people around him, and who found, eventually, more people willing to let him matter than he ever could have imagined possible on that first frightened evening. I think that might be the actual lesson I'd want any of you to carry forward, more than any specific technique or methodology. Stay who you are. Let that be enough. It was always going to be enough. The gathering's conversation drifted, in the comfortable hours that followed, toward lighter, more casual subjects, old stories retold with the particular warmth of familiar company, new updates shared about the accumulated, ever-expanding lives of everyone gathered, and Izuku, settling into the easy, treasured rhythm of the evening's continued unfolding, felt no particular urgency to steer the conversation back toward its earlier, more reflective register, content simply to exist within the accumulated warmth of everything the evening, and the 2 decades preceding it, had ultimately built. As the evening deepened further still around the gathered family, old bonds, and new ones alike, the river moving quietly beside them exactly as it had on the very first evening this entire, extraordinary story began, Izuku, looking around at everyone gathered, the hedgehog who had first seen worth in him before he saw it in himself, the mother whose love had never once wavered, the mentor whose sacrifice had entrusted him with power beyond measure, the 3 remarkable people who had chosen, more than 2 decades earlier, to build a life alongside him, and now 3 full generations of students carrying that same deliberate, generous legacy forward into futures none of them could yet fully see the shape of, felt the complete and total weight of everything more than 2 decades of deliberate, honest choice had ultimately built settle into something he understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, would continue extending outward, generously and completely, for as long as anyone, anywhere, remained willing to choose it, one honest evening, one deliberate choice, one grateful and unbroken generation at a time, exactly as it always had, from that very first evening beside this exact, quietly enduring bench, and exactly as it would, he trusted completely, For every evening still waiting somewhere ahead in a future none of them could fully see, but all of them, together, felt entirely ready to meet. Thanks for listening.